The year was 1993. A small town in upstate New York was about to become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. What happened on that August morning would challenge everything we thought we knew about childhood innocence, about evil, and about the capacity for human redemption. This is the story of Eric Smith, a story that spans 3 decades of legal battles, parole hearings, and a community's struggle to find justice. It's a case that forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Can someone who commits an unthinkable act as a child truly change? And if they can, how do we balance the scales of justice with the possibility of redemption? The events I'm about to share with you are not easy to hear. They involve the brutal murder of a 4-year-old child by a 13-year-old boy. But this story goes far beyond that single horrific day. It's about families torn apart, a legal system pushed to its limits, and the agonizing question of whether someone who takes a life can ever truly be forgiven. In the village of Savona, New York, population barely over 800 people, everyone knew everyone. It was the kind of place where children could walk to the park alone, where neighbors looked out for each other, where nothing truly terrible ever seemed to happen. The social center of this tight-knit community was a small park where kids played baseball and attended summer recreation programs. It was here that 4-year-old Derek Roby spent many of his happiest moments. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy who loved baseball more than anything else in the world. Derek was known throughout the village as an energetic, loving child who could make friends with anyone. His parents, Dale and Doreen, were devoted to their son. Watching him grow into a confident little boy who seemed to light up every room he entered, just across town lived another child who couldn't have been more different. Eric Smith was 13 years old, with bright red hair and freckles that made him stand out in ways he desperately wished he didn't. While Derek was beloved by everyone who met him, Eric was struggling with something much darker. He was bullied relentlessly at school, spending hours riding his bike alone through the streets of Savona, carrying a burden of anger and isolation that no one around him truly understood. On the morning of August 2nd, 1993, both boys would cross paths in a way that would change everything forever. Derek had been attending the recreation program at the park all summer. Every day, his mother Doreen would walk with him the single block from their house to the park, watching as he joined the other children for games and activities. It was a routine they both enjoyed, a simple daily ritual that gave Derek independence while keeping him safe under his mother's watchful eye. But on this particular morning, things were different. Derek's baby brother Dalton was unusually fussy, crying and demanding attention that Doreen couldn't ignore. When it came time for Derek to head to the park, she found herself torn between caring for the baby and maintaining their daily routine. Derek, mature for his 4 years, saw his mother's dilemma and offered a solution that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. The park was only 1 block away, on the same side of the street. There were no roads to cross, no dangerous intersections to navigate. It was a straight shot down a quiet residential street in a town where everyone knew him. For the first time in his life, Doreen allowed her son to make the walk alone. She packed his lunch, gave him a kiss, and told him she loved him. Derek responded with his usual cheerfulness, telling his mother he loved her too before hopping off the sidewalk and heading toward what should have been just another fun day at the park. But Derek never made it to the park that morning. As storm clouds began gathering overhead, Doreen felt something she would later describe as a mother's intuition gone terribly wrong. Despite the rational part of her mind telling her that everything was fine, she experienced an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something catastrophic had happened to her son. When she couldn't shake the feeling, she made the decision to walk to the park to check on Derek. What she discovered there would begin the most horrific chapter of her family's life. The recreation program staff told her that Derek had never arrived. Despite leaving home at his usual time, despite the short distance and familiar route, her son had simply vanished somewhere along that single block between home and safety. Within hours, the entire community of Savona had mobilized to search for the missing boy. Neighbors, friends, local police, and volunteers spread out across the small village, checking every possible location where a 4-year-old might have wandered or become lost. The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening, with hopes growing dimmer as each hour passed without any sign of Derek. Then, as daylight began to fade, searchers made a discovery that would haunt this community forever. In a small patch of woods, just yards from the park where Derek had been heading, and only a few hundred yards from his own front door, they found his body. What had been done to this innocent child was beyond comprehension. Derek had been strangled and beaten to death with rocks in an attack so brutal and methodical that even experienced investigators were shaken by the scene. But the horror didn't end with his death. The killer had continued to abuse and mutilate the child's body in ways that suggested this was far more than a moment of rage or a crime of opportunity. This was something else entirely, something calculated, something that spoke to a level of depravity that seemed impossible to reconcile with the quiet, safe community of Savona. The immediate assumption among residents was that the killer had to be an outsider, some adult predator who had come to their town specifically to hunt for victims. The alternative, that someone from their own community could have committed such an act, was simply too terrible to consider. For 5 days, the investigation continued with no arrests and few leads. The crime scene had been processed, witnesses interviewed, and suspects questioned. But the identity of Derek's killer remained a mystery that seemed to grow more disturbing with each passing hour. Then, on the 5th day after the murder, something unexpected happened. A 13-year-old boy named Eric Smith walked into the police command center, offering to help solve the crime. To the investigators working the case, Eric seemed like any other concerned young person from the community. He was polite, eager to help, and appeared genuinely upset about what had happened to Derek. When they began questioning him about what he might have seen or heard, Eric provided details that seemed helpful to the investigation. But as the interview continued, something began to feel wrong. Eric claimed to have seen Derek on the morning of the murder, walking toward the park. He described what the boy was wearing, what he was carrying, even specific details about his lunch bag. At first, this seemed like valuable eyewitness testimony that could help establish a timeline for Derek's final movements. However, when investigators pressed Eric for more specific information about where he had seen Derek and from what distance, inconsistencies began to emerge. Eric claimed to have observed details that would have been impossible to see from the location he described. His story kept changing in subtle but significant ways. Most troubling of all was Eric's emotional response during the questioning. While he appeared upset on the surface, there was something about his demeanor that struck the experienced investigators as unusual. He seemed almost excited to be part of the investigation, eager to continue talking about the crime in ways that went beyond normal curiosity or concern. When investigators asked Eric to show them exactly where he had been when he claimed to see Derek, they brought him to the location for a videotaped reenactment. What they captured on that tape would later become crucial evidence in understanding what had really happened that morning. During the reenactment, Eric appeared calm and composed, almost enjoying the attention and the chance to play a central role in the investigation. But his story continued to fall apart under scrutiny. The distances were wrong. The sightlines didn't match his claims, and his behavior seemed increasingly inconsistent with that of an innocent witness. The breakthrough came when Eric's own family began to suspect that he knew more about the crime than he was telling. His grandfather, Red Wilson, noticed changes in Eric's behavior and became convinced that the boy was hiding something important. Family members sat Eric down and confronted him directly, begging him to tell them what he knew about Derek's death. They were prepared for the possibility that he might have witnessed something traumatic, or that someone had threatened him into silence. What they weren't prepared for was the truth. In a moment that would shatter multiple families and challenge everything this community thought it knew about the nature of evil, Eric Smith confessed to murdering Derek Roby. The confession was as shocking as it was detailed. Eric didn't just admit to killing the 4-year-old child. He described exactly how he had done it, why he had done it, and most disturbingly of all, how much he had enjoyed it. This wasn't a case of a young person snapping under pressure or acting out in a moment of uncontrolled rage. According to Eric's own words, this was a deliberate, calculated act of violence committed by someone who found pleasure in causing pain. The revelation that a 13-year-old from their own community had committed this horrific crime sent shockwaves through Savona and beyond. How could someone so young be capable of such calculated evil? What had gone wrong in Eric's life to create a killer? And perhaps most importantly, what should be done with a child who had committed an adult crime? These questions would dominate the next phase of this case, as the legal system struggled to determine how to handle a juvenile defendant accused of one of the most brutal murders in the state's history. The prosecution would argue that Eric Smith, despite his young age, knew exactly what he was doing and should be held fully accountable for his actions. The defense would counter that Eric was a deeply troubled child who needed treatment, not punishment. But for Dale and Doreen Roby, the parents who had lost their beloved son in the most unimaginable way possible, the legal debates about juvenile justice and rehabilitation were secondary to a more fundamental question: would they ever see justice for Derek? As Eric Smith's case moved toward trial, the community of Savona would be forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, the limits of forgiveness, and the price of justice in a case that defied easy answers. The trial of Eric Smith began in the summer of 1994, almost exactly 1 year after Derek Roby's murder. The courtroom was packed with community members, media representatives, and family members from both sides, all seeking answers to questions that seemed to have no satisfactory resolution. The prosecution, led by District Attorney John Tunney, painted a picture of a calculating young killer who knew exactly what he was doing when he lured Derek Roby to his death. They argued that Eric's age was irrelevant when weighed against the premeditated nature of his actions and the extreme brutality he had inflicted on an innocent child. The evidence they presented was devastating in its detail. Crime scene photographs showed the methodical nature of the attack, the way Derek's body had been positioned, and the additional acts of violence that had been committed after the child was already dead. This wasn't the work of someone who had simply lost control. They argued this was the calculated behavior of someone who had planned to kill and had enjoyed every moment of it. Perhaps most damning was Eric's own confession, in which he had described not just what he had done, but how it had made him feel. When asked directly whether he had enjoyed killing Derek, Eric had answered without hesitation that yes, he had enjoyed it completely. He hadn't wanted it to end. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend a client who has confessed to such a horrific crime in such chilling detail? Their strategy focused on Eric's mental state, arguing that he was a deeply disturbed child who had been failed by the adults around him and needed treatment rather than punishment. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about Eric's troubled childhood, his history of being bullied, and the psychological damage that had been building inside him for years. They painted a picture of a boy who had been pushed to a breaking point by years of abuse and rejection. Someone who had acted out of psychological compulsion rather than calculated evil. But the prosecution countered with their own experts, who testified that regardless of Eric's psychological problems, he had demonstrated a clear understanding of right and wrong. He had known that what he was doing was illegal and immoral, and he had taken steps to cover up his crime under the law. That was enough to hold him fully responsible for his actions. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing the competing narratives of calculated evil versus damaged childhood. When they returned, their verdict was clear guilty of murder in the second degree. Eric Smith, at 14 years old, was sentenced to 9 years to life in prison. The judge's words at sentencing were harsh and uncompromising, describing Eric's actions as among the most heinous crimes he had ever encountered. There would be no consideration for his youth, no mitigation for his troubled background. He would serve his time as an adult in an adult prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving the minimum 9 years. For Dale and Doreen Roby, the verdict brought a measure of relief, but no real peace. Their son was still gone, and no amount of justice could bring him back. They had hoped that Eric's conviction would allow them to begin healing, to move forward with their lives while keeping Derek's memory alive. What they didn't anticipate was that Eric's sentencing would mark not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of a new kind of torture that would last for decades. The phrase, 9 years to life, carried with it a promise that most people didn't fully understand at the time. While Eric would have to serve at least 9 years before becoming eligible for parole, there was no guarantee that he would be released even then. The parole board would have the discretion to keep him locked up for as long as they deemed necessary to protect public safety. But it also meant that every 2 years after that initial 9-year period, Eric would have the right to appear before the parole board and make his case for release. And every time he did, Dale and Doreen Roby would have to relive the worst day of their lives all over again. Eric's first parole hearing came in 2002, when he was 22 years old. The Robys weren't allowed inside the closed-door proceedings, but they wrote letters and prepared victim impact statements, pleading with the board to keep their son's killer behind bars. The hearing was denied, but the relief was temporary. 2 years later, Eric was back before the board, and 2 years after that, and 2 years after that. Each hearing became a fresh wound for the Roby family, a reminder that their suffering would never truly end as long as Eric Smith remained alive. As the years passed, Eric's appearances before the parole board began to change. The angry, defiant teenager who had been sentenced to prison gradually gave way to what appeared to be a more mature, reflective adult. He spoke about his crime with what seemed like genuine remorse, describing the pain he had caused and expressing his desire to make amends. He participated in prison programs, earned his high school diploma, and worked toward a college degree. He underwent psychological counseling and anger management training. He became a model prisoner with no disciplinary infractions and positive reports from guards and counselors. But for the Robys, these changes meant nothing. They had seen Eric's capacity for deception during the original investigation. The way he had fooled experienced detectives while sitting just feet away from them. How could they trust that his apparent transformation was real rather than just another manipulation designed to secure his freedom? The parole hearings became a ritual of horror for the Roby family. Every 2 years, they would receive a letter informing them of the upcoming hearing. Every 2 years, they would have to prepare new victim impact statements, reliving Derek's murder in excruciating detail. Every 2 years, they would have to argue for why the person who had killed their son should remain in prison. The psychological toll was enormous. Dale Roby described the hearings as serving a life sentence of their own, trapped in an endless cycle of grief and advocacy that prevented them from ever truly moving forward. Doreen spoke about the way the hearings would disrupt their lives for months at a time, the anxiety building as each date approached, and the relief when Eric was denied parole lasting only until the next letter arrived. The community of Savona remained divided on the question of Eric's potential release. Some residents believed that he had been adequately punished and deserved a chance at redemption. Others felt that the nature of his crime was so heinous that he should never be allowed to walk free, regardless of how much he claimed to have changed. For forensic psychologists and criminal justice experts, Eric's case became a fascinating study in juvenile rehabilitation and the possibility of redemption. Could someone who had committed such a calculated act of violence as a child truly be reformed? Was it possible for Eric to have developed the empathy and moral reasoning that he had so clearly lacked at 13? And if such transformation was possible, how could it be reliably measured and verified? These questions became more urgent as Eric's time in prison stretched from years into decades. By 2010, he had been incarcerated for 17 years, far longer than his original minimum sentence. He was now approaching 30 years old, a fully grown adult who bore little resemblance to the angry teenager who had been sent to prison. During his parole hearings, Eric spoke eloquently about his remorse and his understanding of the pain he had caused. He outlined detailed plans for his life after release, including his desire to work with troubled youth and help prevent others from following the path he had taken. He had even become engaged to a woman who had written to him in prison, someone who believed in his capacity for change and redemption. But the parole board remained unconvinced. Time after time, they denied his applications, citing the severity of his original crime and concerns about public safety. The message was clear: some acts are so terrible that they can never be fully forgiven, regardless of how much the perpetrator claims to have changed. For Eric, each denial must have been devastating. He had done everything the system had asked of him. He had served his time without incident, participated in every available program, and demonstrated what appeared to be genuine remorse for his actions. Yet freedom remained elusive, always just out of reach. The case raised fundamental questions about the purpose of the criminal justice system. Was prison meant to punish criminals for their past actions, or to rehabilitate them for future reintegration into society? If Eric had truly been transformed by his years of incarceration, was it just to keep him locked up indefinitely? And if he hadn't been transformed, what did that say about the system's ability to create meaningful change in even the most damaged individuals? These philosophical debates played out against the backdrop of very real human suffering. The Roby family continued to live with the daily reality of their loss, while Eric remained trapped in a system that seemed unable to decide whether he deserved a second chance. Then, in October of 2021, everything changed. Eric Smith appeared before the parole board for the 11th time, now 41 years old and having served 28 years in prison. The hearing followed the same format as all the others, with Eric making his case for release and the board weighing his words against the severity of his original crime. But this time, something was different. Perhaps it was Eric's age, or the length of time he had already served, or simply a shift in the board's thinking about juvenile rehabilitation. Whatever the reason, the decision they reached was one that would send shockwaves through the community of Savona and beyond. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Eric Smith's application for parole was approved. The news hit Dale and Doreen Roby like a physical blow. After fighting for so many years to keep their son's killer behind bars, they now faced the reality that he would soon be walking free. The system they had trusted to deliver justice had ultimately decided that Eric Smith had paid his debt to society. The decision sparked intense debate about the nature of justice and redemption. Supporters of Eric's release pointed to his exemplary record in prison, his apparent transformation, and the fact that he had already served far longer than many adults convicted of similar crimes. They argued that keeping him locked up indefinitely served no purpose other than revenge. Critics, however, saw the decision as a betrayal of Derek Roby's memory and a dangerous gamble with public safety. They pointed to the calculated nature of Eric's original crime and questioned whether someone capable of such evil could ever truly change. The risk of releasing him, they argued, was simply too great to justify. For the residents of Savona, the news brought a mix of emotions. Many were horrified at the thought of Eric returning to their community, while others felt that enough time had passed and that he deserved a chance to rebuild his life. The small town that had been forever changed by Derek's murder now faced the prospect of being changed once again by his killer's release. The parole board had placed conditions on Eric's release that would prevent him from returning to Savona. He would be required to live in a different part of the state, far from the scene of his crime and the community he had traumatized. But for many residents, even this distance felt insufficient. On February 1st, 2022, after serving 28 years and 6 months in prison, Eric Smith walked out of the Woodburn Correctional Facility a free man. There were no cameras present, no media spectacle, just a quiet release that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For the Roby family, Eric's release brought an unexpected sense of closure. After decades of fighting to keep him in prison, they were finally free from the endless cycle of parole hearings and victim impact statements. They could begin to focus on healing rather than advocacy, on celebrating Derek's life rather than fighting against his killer's freedom. The true test of Eric Smith's transformation would come not in prison, but in the outside world. Would he be able to build a productive life as a free man? Would he be able to contribute positively to society? Or would he prove his critics right by reoffending? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps they always will. The case of Eric Smith forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the limits of justice. It challenges us to consider whether anyone, regardless of what they have done, deserves a second chance at life. As Eric Smith begins his new life as a free man, the community of Savona continues to remember Derek Roby. A statue stands in the park where the little boy was headed on that terrible August morning, a permanent reminder of a life cut tragically short and a community forever changed. The story of Eric Smith is ultimately a story about choices and consequences, about the long shadow that a single moment of evil can cast across multiple lives and generations. It's a reminder that justice is not always clean or satisfying, and that some questions about human nature may never have clear answers. What we do know is that somewhere in New York, Eric Smith is living as a free man, carrying with him the weight of what he did as a 13-year-old boy. Whether that weight will continue to shape his life in positive ways, or whether the darkness that once consumed him will resurface, remains to be seen. The gamble on Eric Smith's redemption has been made. Only time will tell whether it was the right choice. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983 in Manassas, Virginia. He was the third of 4 children in a family that blended different cultural backgrounds. His father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., a retired military officer and magistrate, was of German descent. while his mother, Gladys Zimmerman, was born in Peru and worked as a court interpreter. Their family is modest, but still maintains traditional values. From a young age, George was raised with a sense of discipline, community service, and civic responsibility. He was quiet, even withdrawn, in school. He struggled academically, but made up for it with a strong sense of loyalty and structure. After graduating from high school, he moved to Florida with vague, undefined dreams. He studied at Seminole State College intermittently, working small jobs, one as an insurance underwriter and another in a car dealership, before eventually settling into a role as a security officer for a gated community. He also volunteered with the Neighborhood Watch, viewing it not just as a task, but a responsibility. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who wanted to help, who sometimes took things too seriously, and who clearly admired law enforcement. George had, at points, voiced aspirations of becoming a police officer. He attended community forums, signed up for citizen police academies, and familiarized himself with Florida law. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the demeanor of someone who believed he was serving and protecting. His past, however, included some red flags: an arrest for assaulting an undercover officer, a charge later dropped after completing a diversion program, and a restraining order filed during a dispute with an ex-fiancée. Nevertheless, George always considered himself a man of order and discipline. In 2009, he married Shelley, a licensed cosmetologist. The couple lived in a rented townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a mixed-race gated community in Sanford, Florida. Though George lacked formal authority, he often took it upon himself to patrol his neighborhood, especially after a string of break-ins had left many residents uneasy. He obtained a concealed weapons permit and began carrying a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. For him, safety was paramount, and something he felt personally charged to ensure. Trayvon Martin, born February 5, 1995 in Miami, Florida, was the youngest son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. Although his parents were separated, they remained cooperative and respectful in raising their children, with a primary focus on their son. Trayvon split his time between his mother's home in Miami Gardens and his father's home in Sanford, often visiting extended family on school breaks and holidays. Trayvon is curious, energetic, and brings warmth and positivity to those around him. At 17, he loved playing video games, participating in sports, listening to rap music, and once expressed his dream of becoming a pilot in school. Trayvon sometimes got into trouble. He had been suspended multiple times, including once for the possession of a small amount of a banned substance. His family admitted he made mistakes, but pointed out that he was just like any other teenage boy still navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood. While he wasn't perfect, he wasn't dangerous either. In February 2012, Trayvon was staying in Sanford with his father's fiancée, Brandy Green. His father hoped the change of pace would be good for him, a reset of sorts. Trayvon was familiar with the area, comfortable in the Retreat at Twin Lakes community. Like many boys his age, he regularly texts, listens to music, and calls his friends. One of those friends, a young woman named Rachel Jontel, would later say that Trayvon had been nervous that week, worried about a man who was watching him. George and Trayvon came from vastly different backgrounds, shaped by distinct experiences, values, and circumstances. Yet, on the night of February 26, 2012, their lives intersected in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. This chance meeting would spark a national conversation, disrupt a quiet town, and leave a lasting impact on America. What began as an ordinary Sunday in the Retreat at Twin Lakes a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges and uniform townhomes, took a tragic turn. A light rain fell over the area, and the streets were mostly quiet. Behind this calm, however, tensions were simmering within the community after a string of recent burglaries. Nervous residents whispered about unfamiliar faces, and George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch captain, took it upon himself to act. George regularly patrolled the area, logging numerous calls to authorities about suspicious activity. Armed with a legally concealed 9mm handgun, he saw his role as a protector, shouldering what he believed others would not. At 7:09 p.m., George spotted a young man walking slowly in the rain and called the non-emergency police line. He reported the individual looked suspicious and up to no good. His description, a teenager in a dark hoodie and jeans. Frustration crept into his voice as he added, "These assholes, they always get away." When asked by the dispatcher if he was following the person, George confirmed he was. The dispatcher advised that they didn't need him to do that. But George had already exited his vehicle and followed the young man on foot. The man George was tracking was 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. That evening, Trayvon had walked to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy Arizona fruit juice and Skittles. On his way back, with his hoodie up to keep out the drizzle, he was on the phone with a friend, Rachel Jontel. Their conversation was lighthearted, but took a worried tone when Trayvon mentioned someone was following him. Rachel urged him to run, and he did. Then George and Trayvon come face to face, a moment filled with uncertainty. By 7:16 p.m., neighbors began calling 911, reporting a physical struggle. In the background of these frantic calls, shouts for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. When police arrived, Trayvon was found lying face down in the grass, a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, George stood with minor injuries, a bloody nose and abrasions on his head. According to George, Trayvon had attacked him, punched him, and reached for his gun, fearing for his life. George said he fired in self-defense. His firearm was still in its holster when officers arrived. George was questioned but released the same night. Initially, the case garnered little attention. The police categorized the shooting as a self-defense incident, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger, with no obligation to retreat. For the Sanford police, this explanation appeared sufficient. No arrest was made. However, for Trayvon's parents, and eventually much of the nation, this outcome was unacceptable. The events of that night and their consequences sparked an intense and divisive national debate. In the aftermath of Trayvon's death, his parents, Tracy and Sabrina, demanded answers. Why hadn't there been an arrest? Why was no one held accountable for their son's death? Their voices grew louder as they appeared on news programs, held press conferences, and shared images of Trayvon, a smiling, affectionate teenager who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Public outrage began to build, and the community became deeply divided. For many, this wasn't just a local tragedy, but a national crisis. Trayvon was young, black, and unarmed. George was older, armed, and had been advised not to pursue Trayvon. To a significant portion of the public, the facts were painfully clear. Trayvon's hoodie became a powerful symbol of injustice. Protests erupted nationwide, with students walking out of schools and marches held from Harlem to Los Angeles, all chanting justice for Trayvon. The Sanford Police Department faced harsh criticism. Chris Serino, the case's original lead investigator, expressed doubts about George's account. even testifying later that George could have avoided the encounter altogether. However, other officers disagreed, leading to division within the department and the broader community over the decision not to arrest George. The release of the 911 tapes became a tipping point. The background of the calls included desperate cries for help, analyzed repeatedly by experts. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina, identified the voice as her son's. While George's family claimed it was George's, forensic experts could not reach a consensus. Still, the haunting sound of those screams gripped the nation. By mid-March, the pressure forced Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee to step aside temporarily. Florida's Governor, Rick Scott, appointed Angela Corey as a special prosecutor to independently investigate the case. Finally, on April 11, 2012, after weeks of mounting tension, George was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During the announcement, Angela stated solemnly that they had not come to that decision lightly and that they had based it on the facts and the law. George turned himself in to the authorities and appeared in court, looking pale and expressionless. His initial request for bond was denied, but later granted at $150,000. Media swarmed the courtroom, while protesters gathered outside with signs, wearing hoodies pulled tightly. Inside, attorneys began preparing for a trial that would become about far more than just the guilt or innocence of one man. Evidence remained contradictory. George's injuries seemed to support his claim of being attacked, while Trayvon's autopsy revealed signs of a struggle. The trial will revolve around the perspectives and decisions regarding whose plea for help in the 911 call is justified. George claimed he was in fear for his life, while prosecutors argued Trayvon had every reason to feel afraid first. As the trial approached, Sanford prepared for the weighty proceedings. The trial would not only focus on George or Trayvon, but also ignite debates about justice, race, self-defense laws, and the devastating consequences of fear and suspicion. The courtroom became a reflection of the nation, exposing truths many sought to deny and others could never escape. At its heart was an undeniable tragedy. A teenager lost his life. A man faced criminal charges, and the nation anxiously awaited the outcome. On June 10, 2013, nearly 18 months after Trayvon's death, State of Florida v. George began at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center. The courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and the families of both Trayvon and George, all watching silently. George, dressed in a suit and tie, sat beside his attorneys, facing a charge of second-degree murder that carried the possibility of life in prison. While his eyes remained fixed forward, the eyes of the nation were squarely on him. Was George defending himself? Or was he the one who initiated a deadly confrontation that could have been avoided? The question was complex and had no simple answer. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, argued that George was mistaken in believing that a teenager walking through his neighborhood posed a threat, and then pursued, confronted, and killed him. De la Rionda told the jury that the case was not about race, but about right and wrong, emphasizing that George's actions were wrong. Prosecutors contended that George, armed with a gun, ignored a police dispatcher's suggestion to stop following Trayvon. This decision led to the confrontation that ended in Trayvon's death. To support their case, the prosecution brought forensic experts, audio specialists, and key witnesses to reconstruct the events of that night. The jury was played 911 recordings, with the screams in the background analyzed repeatedly in court. Both Trayvon's and George's families were asked to identify the voice. The prosecutor asked Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, who she recognized the voice to be. and she replied, her voice shaking, that it was Trayvon. In contrast, Gladys, George's mother, testified that the screams belonged to her son, stating that she knew it was George, as she had heard her son screaming for his life. The trial became an emotional clash of perspectives. Trayvon's friend, Rachel, who had been on the phone with him shortly before the shooting, testified about his fear and confusion. Her testimony was deeply personal but divisive. Defense attorneys questioned her credibility, while others criticized the racial and cultural biases shaping the public's perception of her. The defense, led by Mark O'Mara, portrayed George as a man attacked by Trayvon, pinned to the ground, and beaten. They presented photos of George's bloodied nose and head injuries and called witnesses to corroborate his account. John Good, a neighbor, testified that he had seen someone in a dark hoodie on top of another person during the struggle, which matched Trayvon as the aggressor. John said that the person on the bottom had been the one yelling for help. George did not testify, following his attorney's advice. Instead, the defense relied on George's recorded statements to the police, which were played for the jury. In these interviews, George described Trayvon as the aggressor and claimed he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Trayvon had followed him, punched him, and slammed his head into the sidewalk. He stated that he had been screaming for help and had thought he was going to die. The defense aimed to establish enough reasonable doubt to show that George's actions stemmed not from malice, but from fear. Under Florida's self-defense and stand your ground laws, that fear justified acquittal. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the trial, with emotional reactions from both families, jurors, an all-female group of 6, 5 of whom were white, carefully took notes and observed testimony. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to rely on common sense, asserting that George had made a false preconception about Trayvon. De La Rionda argued that George had considered Trayvon a suspect from the start, when in fact he had every right to be there. The defense, in contrast, focused on the physical evidence and George's feelings of fear. Mark declared that there were no monsters in this matter and insisted that the only fair verdict was to declare George innocent. After more than 16 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a verdict was reached. On July 13, 2013, just after 10:00 p.m., George was found not guilty. Silence filled the courtroom. George showed little reaction as his family quietly embraced. Trayvon's parents were not present, choosing to avoid the emotional weight of the moment. News outlets announced the verdict to the nation, their tone measured but solemn. Almost immediately, demonstrations erupted across the country, some peaceful, others filled with anger and grief, all stemming from deep pain. The jury later admitted that reaching a decision had been difficult. One juror, known only as B37, shared in an interview that they had all wanted to find George guilty of something, but the law had given them nothing to convict him of. Another anonymous juror explained that George's fear for his life in that moment aligned with the case the defense presented and the legal standards they had to apply. The law ultimately determined the outcome of this case, but for many, it didn't feel like true justice. Nonetheless, the law had the final say. George was acquitted. Legally, the matter was closed. But the story, with all its pain, division, and reckoning, was far from over. George Zimmerman was found legally innocent and set free. But his real life was not the same. The world he re-entered had fundamentally shifted, and so had he. Overnight, he became a polarizing figure celebrated by some and condemned by many. In the years following his acquittal, George remained a controversial figure, frequently making headlines, not for his freedom, but for a series of troubles. He was involved in road rage incidents, domestic disputes, and public altercations. He sued media outlets and political figures, and even auctioned off the gun used in Trayvon's death. For George, freedom did not bring peace. Trayvon Martin, however, never got another chance. He remained forever 17, preserved in the final photo shared by his parents, his face youthful and his hoodie pulled over his head. Yet, his name became far bigger than his life. It resonated in conversations, classrooms, protests, and policy debates. His death became a symbol, not only for justice but for systemic reform. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They founded the Trayvon Martin Foundation to combat gun violence and support families impacted by it. Though their pain never subsided, they carried it with grace and turned it into purpose, demonstrating how dignity could exist in the face of profound loss. The trial's impact rippled across the United States. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of defiance. His tragic story sparked urgent dialogue about race, profiling, and perception. For many, his death marked a turning point, a moment when either something broke or something awakened. This loss fueled a movement, giving rise to a rallying cry, Black Lives Matter. Sanford, Florida, once an unremarkable city, became a focal point of America's ongoing struggle with race and justice. The police force underwent changes in leadership, and community initiatives intensified. Yet, the weight of those events never truly lifted. That night and its aftermath left a lasting impression not only on Sanford, but on the entire nation. Years later, the same questions lingered. What if George had stayed in his car? What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Trayvon Martin had survived? There are no definitive answers, only pain, and the harsh reality that, in that rain, the encounter between an armed man and a black teenager forever changed the way America saw itself. When Americans think of tropical paradise, they picture crystal-clear waters, swaying palm trees, and endless possibilities for a fresh start. But sometimes what looks like paradise on the surface can hide something much darker underneath. Today, we're diving into a case that shocked investigators across 2 countries and revealed just how far someone will go to cover up the truth. This is the story of Devil's Island, where the American dream turned into an unimaginable nightmare. In the autumn of 2011, a young American couple arrived on the remote Caribbean islands of Panama with hopes of starting their new life together. Yvonne Baldelli, recently divorced and looking for adventure, had fallen head over heels for Brian Bermager, a decorated former Marine who seemed to have everything going for him. Brian had served 7 years in the Marine Corps, stationed in Washington, D.C., as part of the Honor Guard. There were even photographs of him standing in the White House alongside President George W. Bush. From the outside looking in, this guy had the perfect all-American persona that would make any woman's heart skip a beat. After completing his military service, Brian decided he needed to decompress and find his next chapter. Panama seemed like the ideal place to do exactly that. The cost of living was incredibly low, the beaches were pristine, and for someone with musical aspirations like Brian, the local bar scene offered plenty of opportunities to perform. Yvonne was absolutely smitten with this man. She saw him as her Prince Charming, the person she'd been waiting for her entire life. When Brian suggested they pack up everything and move to Panama together, she didn't hesitate for a second. Michelle Valenzuela, Yvonne's sister, watched as her sibling threw herself completely into this relationship. Yvonne was the type of person who gave 100% of herself when she fell in love, and she expected that same level of commitment in return. But Michelle had her reservations about Brian from the very beginning, despite her concerns. Yvonne was determined to make this work. She brought 2 sewing machines with her to Panama, planning to start a clothing business making bathing suits for tourists. With her beloved dog, Georgia May, by her side, she was ready to build the life she'd always dreamed of. The couple settled on Isla Carnero in Bocas del Toro, a small island community where expats from around the world came to escape their old lives. They rented a house right on the water, and Brian quickly became a fixture at the local bars, playing guitar and singing for food and drinks. At first, everything seemed perfect. Yvonne sent regular emails home to her family, painting a picture of tropical bliss. She described their morning runs on the beach, swimming in the crystal-clear ocean, and the excitement of building something new together in paradise. The local expat community welcomed them with open arms. Bar owners let Brian perform in exchange for meals and free alcohol. Yvonne seemed genuinely happy, and to anyone watching from the outside, they looked like a couple living their best life. But beneath the surface, cracks were already starting to show. Brian's drinking was becoming more and more problematic. What started as a few beers after performances turned into heavy drinking sessions that lasted well into the night. Some locals noticed that his musical abilities seemed to deteriorate the more he drank, describing his intoxicated singing voice as resembling a hound dog on a porch. More concerning were the signs of trouble in paradise that some observant neighbors began to notice. There were reports of loud arguments coming from their house, and on at least one occasion, locals saw bruises on Yvonne's face that she tried desperately to hide. Despite these warning signs, Yvonne's family back in the United States remained optimistic about the relationship. Her emails continued to arrive regularly, filled with stories of their tropical adventures. Her father, Jim Faust, could picture every detail of their new life based on her vivid descriptions. He genuinely believed that Brian might be the one for his daughter. But then, around Thanksgiving 2011, something changed. The frequent, cheerful emails from Yvonne began to slow down. Michelle noticed immediately that the communication pattern had shifted, and her sisterly instincts started kicking in. Days turned into weeks, and still no word from Yvonne. Finally, on December 14th, Michelle received a text message from an unknown number. It wasn't from Yvonne at all, but from Brian, asking to make arrangements to pick up his truck that he'd left at Michelle's house in California. When Michelle called the number, Brian calmly explained that he and Yvonne were no longer together. He claimed they'd gotten into a fight because she'd discovered he had a child from a previous relationship, something he'd never mentioned before. According to Brian, Yvonne had simply packed up and left without a word. This revelation was devastating for Yvonne, who was unable to have children due to a medical condition. Learning that the man she'd sacrificed everything for had been hiding the existence of his own child would have been absolutely earth-shattering. But Michelle wasn't buying Brian's story. When she suggested they go to the police together to file a missing persons report, since he was the last person to see Yvonne, Brian seemed reluctant to get involved. That's when Michelle decided to dig deeper into her email account, where she discovered a message she'd previously overlooked. It was from Yvonne herself, sent shortly after Brian's call, explaining that she and Brian had broken up and that she was headed to Costa Rica with a man she'd met when they first arrived in Panama. The email described Brian as a lying, cheating individual and claimed that Yvonne should have trusted her instincts about him from the beginning. While the message provided some explanation for what had happened, something about it didn't sit right with Michelle. The timing seemed off, and certain phrases in the email just didn't sound like something her sister would say. Yvonne had never been the type to run off impulsively with someone she barely knew, especially after such a traumatic discovery about Brian's secret child. 3 weeks later, another email arrived from Yvonne, this time saying she was getting homesick and making plans to return home by the second week of January. She mentioned she'd been staying with someone and was looking forward to seeing everyone again. This second email provided some comfort to the family, who assumed Yvonne would show up at their planned family gathering in January. But when that reunion came and went without any sign of Yvonne, Michelle knew something was terribly wrong. Her father, Jim, shared her concerns. After decades of knowing his daughter, he was certain that Yvonne would never simply disappear without maintaining contact with her family. She was too responsible, too caring, and too connected to the people she loved to just vanish into thin air. That's when Michelle decided to take matters into her own hands and investigate further. She reached out to a tech-savvy cousin who could trace the IP addresses of the emails supposedly sent by Yvonne from Panama and Costa Rica. What they discovered would change everything and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the dark truth about what really happened on Devil's Island. The cousin's investigation revealed something that sent chills down Michelle's spine. The emails that were supposedly sent from Panama showed IP addresses consistent with that location. But the email claiming Yvonne was in Costa Rica, living with another man, showed an IP address from Dana Point, California, exactly where Brian was now living. This meant that someone had been using Yvonne's email account to impersonate her, sending messages to her family from Brian's computer in the United States. The realization hit Michelle like a sledgehammer. Her sister wasn't hiding out in Costa Rica with some mysterious new boyfriend. Someone had been playing an elaborate game of deception, and that someone was Brian Brimmager. With this damning evidence in hand, Michelle knew she had to act fast. She contacted the FBI, where she met with Special Agent Andrew Masters, a seasoned investigator who immediately recognized the significance of what Michelle had uncovered. The IP address evidence was a smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that foul play was involved. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into Yvonne's disappearance, with Masters taking the lead. They contacted the State Department to check immigration records, which confirmed what Yvonne's family had suspected all along. There was no record of her ever leaving Panama or entering Costa Rica. Meanwhile, Yvonne's family couldn't wait for the wheels of justice to turn slowly. They decided to take matters into their own hands and travel to Panama to search for answers themselves. They connected with Don Winner, a legendary investigator and former U.S. intelligence officer who had built a reputation for solving impossible cases in Central America. Winner was known throughout Panama as the person to call when bad things happened to American citizens. He'd already helped put away 3 serial killers and had an uncanny ability to crack the most complex murder cases. When he heard Yvonne's story, he immediately knew they were dealing with something sinister. His assessment was blunt and chilling. The chances that Yvonne was running around Costa Rica with some other man were essentially zero. Winner believed they were looking at a murder case, and Brian Brimmager was their prime suspect. Back in the United States, the FBI was putting pressure on Brian, conducting surveillance and building their case. They discovered that within weeks of Yvonne's disappearance, Brian had not only returned to California, but had gotten engaged and married to Kristen Verkhoven, a woman he'd met while she was working at the White House. The timeline was shocking. Brian had proposed to Kristen just days after Yvonne disappeared in Panama. Wedding photos showed a couple that appeared blissfully happy, completely unaware of the dark secret that lurked beneath Brian's charming exterior. What made this revelation even more disturbing was that Kristen was the mother of Brian's secret child, the very discovery that had allegedly caused the final fight between Brian and Yvonne. Brian had been living a double life, maintaining relationships with two women simultaneously, neither fully aware of the other's existence. In Panama, Winner organized a press conference with local authorities to publicize Yvonne's disappearance and put pressure on anyone who might have information. For the first time, Panamanian police officially declared that Yvonne was the victim of foul play and named Brian Brimmager as their primary suspect. The press conference sent shockwaves around the world. Here was a decorated former Marine, someone who had served his country with honor and stood in the White House with the president, now being accused of murdering his girlfriend in a tropical paradise. As news of the case spread, witnesses began coming forward with disturbing accounts of Brian and Yvonne's relationship. Local bar owners and residents described a pattern of verbal and physical abuse that painted a very different picture from the happy couple Yvonne had portrayed in her emails home. One bar owner recalled seeing Yvonne with black eyes and bruises around her face. When asked about her injuries, she tried to hide them and refused to discuss what had happened. The revelation that Brian had been physically abusing Yvonne was devastating for her family, who had no idea she was suffering in silence. Jeff Salzman, who owned one of the local establishments where Brian performed, described him as a scary person who he didn't want to be around. The image of the clean-cut, all-American Marine was crumbling as more and more people shared their experiences with the couple. Yvonne's family organized search parties to comb through the dense jungle and swampland surrounding the island where she'd disappeared. The terrain was brutal. Thick tropical vegetation filled with spiders, snakes, and every kind of dangerous creature imaginable. The water was murky and rancid, making it nearly impossible to see anything beneath the surface, despite the challenging conditions. Volunteers joined the family in their desperate search for any trace of Yvonne. They found various items, a purse, medicine bottles, even a U.S. passport. But none belonged to Yvonne. Each discovery raised hopes only to dash them moments later. The search was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Lauren Beyer, Yvonne's niece, found herself in the heartbreaking position of hoping to find her aunt, while simultaneously dreading what that discovery might look like after so much time had passed. Back in California, the FBI was closing in on Brian Brimmager. Agent Masters had obtained a warrant to search Brian's residence, where he made a crucial discovery. Sitting on a table in Brian's living room was a white Sony Vaio laptop computer, the exact same type of computer that Yvonne had taken with her to Panama. When Masters saw the laptop, he immediately suspected it belonged to Yvonne. His instincts proved correct. The computer contained a wealth of evidence that would ultimately help unravel the mystery of what happened on that remote Caribbean island. The laptop revealed Brian's internet search history, which painted a chilling picture of premeditation. In the days following Yvonne's disappearance, someone had used the computer to search for information about removing blood from mattresses and other incriminating queries that suggested someone was trying to cover up a violent crime. Perhaps most damning of all, the computer contained evidence that Brian had been using Yvonne's email account to send those fake messages to her family. The digital trail clearly showed that the emails claiming she was alive and well in Costa Rica had actually been composed and sent from Brian's residence in California. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Brian had been using Yvonne's debit card to withdraw money from her accounts after her disappearance. ATM surveillance footage captured him making these transactions, providing visual proof that he was accessing her finances while letting her family believe she was safe. As the evidence mounted against him, Brian Brimmager continued to maintain his innocence and live his new life as if nothing had happened. He spent his days playing golf, caring for his young daughter, and enjoying the comfortable suburban lifestyle that his new marriage provided. But the FBI wasn't about to let him escape justice. They were building an airtight case, piece by piece, that would eventually bring him to account for what investigators believed was a carefully planned and executed murder in Paradise. In 2013, nearly 2 years after Yvonne had vanished without a trace, the FBI finally made their move. Special Agent Andrew Masters approached Brian Brimmager's apartment with handcuffs in hand, ready to end this elaborate charade once and for all. When Masters knocked on the door, Brian answered and invited him inside, claiming he'd been expecting this visit. For more than 4 hours, while Brian casually babysat his young daughter, Masters grilled him about the inconsistencies in his story and the mounting evidence against him. Brian continued to stick to his original narrative. He insisted that Yvonne had left him for another man, that she'd gone to Costa Rica willingly, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But when confronted with the IP address evidence and the fact that her supposed emails from Costa Rica were actually sent from his computer, Brian began to stumble. The pressure was mounting, and cracks were starting to show in his carefully constructed facade. Masters could see the doubt creeping into Brian's eyes as the evidence piled up against him. But even then, this former Marine refused to break. Brian was arrested and charged with 13 felonies related to the cover-up of Yvonne's death. However, without a body, prosecutors couldn't yet bring murder charges. That would all change in the most dramatic way possible. In June 2013, a local worker clearing brush on the very island where Brian and Yvonne had lived made a discovery that would finally bring closure to this tragic case. Hidden in the dense jungle, just a few hundred yards from where Yvonne's family had spent days searching, he found a duffel bag. When the worker unbuckled the clasp and looked inside, he discovered Yvonne's skeletonized remains. After 2 years in the tropical elements, only bones remained of the vibrant young woman who had come to Panama with such hope and excitement. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. This was Yvonne Baldelli, and her remains told a horrific story of what had really happened in Paradise. The autopsy revealed that she had been dismembered, most likely after being stabbed in the back at least twice. The discovery of Yvonne's body allowed prosecutors to finally bring murder charges against Brian Brimmager. But for Michelle Valenzuela, who had fought tirelessly for justice for her sister, time was running out in her own battle for survival. Michelle had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and doctors gave her just weeks to live. Despite her deteriorating condition, she was determined to see this case through to the end. In what would be one of her final acts of love for her sister, Michelle agreed to give crucial testimony while she still could. The courtroom scene was heartbreaking. Michelle, weakened by cancer but fueled by determination, sat directly across from Brian Brimmager and told the world about her sister's disappearance. She pointed him out in the courtroom, identifying him as the man who had destroyed her family. The testimony was exhausting, and Michelle collapsed afterward from the strain. But she had accomplished what she set out to do. Her words would be preserved forever, ensuring that Yvonne's story would be told and that justice would prevail. Days later, Michelle passed away, having given everything she had to find the truth about what happened to her beloved sister. Meanwhile, investigators made another breakthrough that would seal Brian's fate. Remember that machete he had sold on Facebook after Yvonne's disappearance? The one he had joked about using to chop up one stripper. The FBI had tracked it down and subjected it to advanced forensic testing. While Brian had cleaned the blade thoroughly, he had missed something crucial. When investigators removed the handle, they found Yvonne's blood and DNA trapped underneath where no amount of cleaning could reach it. This was the smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that this weapon had been used to dismember her body. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, Brian Brimager's house of lies finally collapsed. His lawyers advised him that fighting these charges would be futile, and in early 2016 he finally admitted defeat. In a dramatic reversal, Brian pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. After nearly 5 years of lies, manipulation, and deception, he finally admitted in open court that he had killed Yvonne Baldelli. He offered an apology to her family, but his words rang hollow after everything he had put them through. The judge sentenced Brian Brimager to 26 years in federal prison. For a man who had once stood in the White House as an honored Marine, this was a spectacular fall from grace. He would spend the best years of his life behind bars, paying for the terrible crime he committed in paradise. With the case finally resolved, Yvonne's remains were returned to her family for a proper burial. In a touching ceremony, they laid her to rest at sea, knowing that she loved the ocean and would finally be at peace in the waters she had found so beautiful. The case of Devil's Island serves as a chilling reminder that paradise can quickly turn into hell when dangerous people are involved. Yvonne Baldelli went to Panama looking for love and adventure, but instead found herself trapped with a man capable of unthinkable violence. Brian Brimager's ability to live multiple lives simultaneously, decorated Marine, loving husband, and cold-blooded killer, shows how easily predators can hide among us. His wife, Kristen, continues to support him and visit him in prison, apparently still believing in his innocence despite his guilty plea. The real heroes of this story are the family members who never gave up searching for the truth. Michelle Valenzuela's determination to find justice for her sister, even while battling terminal cancer, demonstrates the power of love and persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Today, Brian Brimager sits in federal prison, where he will remain until 2037. The tropical paradise of Panama continues to attract visitors from around the world, but for those who knew Yvonne Baldelli, the islands will forever be haunted by the memory of what happened there. This case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding behind the most respectable facades. A military uniform, a charming smile, and an all-American persona can mask the darkest of intentions. And sometimes, what looks like paradise from the outside can be nothing more than Devil's Island in disguise. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person you think you know, a face you recognize, a voice you trust, someone who's been inside your home, someone you've hired, someone you've helped. It's September 8th, 2010, and for one Kansas woman, an ordinary morning is about to become a nightmare that will change her life forever. Marty Hill had no reason to be afraid that morning. At just 97 pounds, she was a powerhouse at work, known for her reliability and dedication. Her co-workers called her dynamite in a small package. She was the type of person who always showed up, always got things done, always made everything around her better. Which is exactly why, when she didn't show up for the 10 o'clock production meeting at her apparel company, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The tight-knit group at her workplace had never seen Marty miss a meeting without explanation. She was dependable to a fault. When text messages went unanswered and phone calls went straight to voicemail, concern quickly turned to fear. By 11:30 that morning, a co-worker made the decision to drive to Marty's house. What they found there would launch an investigation that would reveal just how dangerous it can be to trust the wrong person. Marty's car sat in the driveway. Her front door was closed but unlocked. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen table. But Marty was nowhere to be found upstairs. It wasn't until police arrived and ventured into the basement that they discovered the horrifying truth. At the bottom of those basement stairs lay a woman covered head to toe in blood, breathing but barely alive. The amount of blood surrounding her on the floor told a story of unimaginable violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random break-in. This was something far more personal and infinitely more terrifying. The officer who found her knelt beside the barely conscious woman and asked the question that would drive the entire investigation. Who did this to you? Who did this in those critical moments? As Marty fought for her life, the race was on to find her attacker before they could strike again. When paramedics rushed Marty to the hospital, doctors were stunned by the extent of her injuries. The major veins, skin, and muscle of her left neck had been completely severed. The major artery had multiple scrapes on it, missing complete severance by mere millimeters. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in bruises that spoke to a sustained and vicious beating. The head trauma alone was life-threatening. For the next hour and a half, surgeons worked meticulously to piece together the damage, cleaning and repairing injuries that should have killed her. Even then, doctors remained gravely concerned about brain swelling and the possibility that Marty might not survive the next 24 to 72 hours. Her family arrived at the hospital to find a woman they barely recognized. Marty's eyes were swollen completely shut. Her head was 3 times its normal size. Her teenage daughter later described seeing only her mother's hands and knowing those were the only parts she could still identify. The emotional trauma of seeing their loved one in this condition was almost unbearable. But even as Marty fought for her life in the ICU, investigators were working around the clock to find her attacker. With no signs of sexual assault and no theft from the home, the motive remained a complete mystery. Marty's mother provided crucial information about her daughter's quiet lifestyle. She was a workaholic who rarely left the house except for work. She wasn't dating anyone and kept to herself. The investigation initially focused on Marty's ex-husband, Steve Hill. In cases like this, law enforcement always looks first at those closest to the victim. But Steve was cooperative, providing a detailed account of his activities that day and expressing genuine concern for Marty's well-being. He wanted to find her attacker just as desperately as everyone else did. With Steve cleared as a suspect, investigators found themselves with very limited leads. That's when Marty's mother mentioned B&J Construction, a company that had recently done work on both her home and Marty's. The supervisor, a man named Brian, had seemed like a nice guy, a hard worker, and a family man. Marty's mother had even recommended him based on the quality work he'd done at her house. Brian Pennington was 26 years old and lived in Leeton, Missouri, about an hour and a half from Kansas City. When detectives arrived at his secluded dark house around 9 p.m., they found him polite and cooperative. But something wasn't right. Brian had several fresh scratches on the left side of his face that he claimed came from his dog jumping on him the day before. To the trained eyes of experienced investigators, those scratches didn't look consistent with what a dog would do. Brian kept emphasizing his financial difficulties, claiming there was no way he could have driven to Kansas City because he didn't have money for gas. His young wife, Jessica, backed up his alibi, insisting he'd been home with her the entire time. But when detectives asked to search Brian's clothing for any bloodstains, he readily agreed. What they found in a hamper in the corner of the bathroom would change everything. A pair of jeans near the bottom was covered in red stains, concentrated around the knees and lower portions of the legs. Brian claimed the stains weren't blood, but when detectives rushed the jeans to the crime lab that same night, they tested positive for human blood within 30 minutes. The question now was whose blood it was, and investigators would have to wait several more days for DNA results. The cooperation Brian showed in allowing the search of his home surprised investigators. Most guilty parties don't willingly hand over evidence that could convict them. But perhaps Brian thought the investigation wouldn't go any further. that his word and his wife's alibi would be enough to clear him. Meanwhile, Marty remained in critical condition, unable to communicate with investigators. Doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her recovery was far from certain. The attack had been so brutal, so sustained, that it seemed impossible anyone could survive it. Yet somehow, Marty was fighting back. On the third day after the attack, everything changed. Marty suddenly began to speak, and with her words came the flood of memories from that terrible morning. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in her voice. She knew exactly who had attacked her and why she had opened her door to him that early morning. The man she named would shock everyone who knew him as a trusted contractor, a family man, someone who had been welcomed into homes throughout the community. But appearances, as this case would prove, can be fatally deceiving. As the DNA results came back, confirming that the blood on Brian Pennington's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much darker, and the question that haunted everyone involved was simple: why? Brian Pennington had been in Marty's home before. He'd done work there, earned her trust, been paid for his services. When he knocked on her door that September morning, she had no reason to fear him. She recognized his face, knew his voice, remembered the quality of his work. It was this familiarity that made him so dangerous. According to Marty's recollection, Brian mentioned something about the basement, something he thought she should know about from his previous work there. It seemed reasonable enough. Contractors often remembered details about jobs, noticed things that needed attention. So when he suggested they go downstairs to look at something, Marty led the way. She was 2 steps from the bottom when everything changed. Without warning, without explanation, Brian grabbed her throat with a grip so tight and strong that her voice began to fade. She kept asking what he was doing, but he remained silent. The man who had made pleasant conversation during his work visits now showed no emotion, offered no explanation for the violence he was inflicting. As her voice grew weaker and softer, Marty realized she couldn't speak at all. Then darkness took over, and she lost consciousness. What happened next would be reconstructed by forensic evidence and medical testimony, painting a picture of violence so extreme it defied comprehension. The investigation revealed that after strangling Marty into unconsciousness, Brian didn't stop there. Evidence suggested he then beat her head repeatedly against the concrete basement floor, causing multiple facial fractures and severe brain trauma. The sustained nature of the attack spoke to a level of rage that seemed completely disconnected from any rational motive. But even that wasn't enough. In what prosecutors would later describe as an act of pure evil, Brian then took out a knife and slashed Marty's throat 3 to 4 times, leaving her to die alone in her basement. The cuts were so deep they severed major blood vessels and came within millimeters of completely cutting through her main artery. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable brutality. Blood covered the basement floor from corner to corner. The violence had been so extensive, so sustained, that investigators who had worked hundreds of cases said they'd never seen anything quite like it. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control in a moment of anger. This was methodical, deliberate, and designed to ensure the victim would not survive. But Brian Pennington had made one critical miscalculation. He believed Marty was dead when he left her basement that morning. He had no way of knowing that this small, seemingly fragile woman possessed a strength that would defy every medical expectation. When investigators arrived at his door that evening, Brian appeared genuinely surprised to learn that Marty was still alive. His cooperation during the initial interview now made perfect sense. If he believed his victim was dead, then there would be no witness to identify him. The scratches on his face could be explained away. The blood on his jeans could be dismissed as something else entirely. He likely thought the investigation would focus elsewhere, perhaps on a stranger or someone with an obvious motive. The DNA evidence changed everything. When the lab confirmed that the blood on Brian's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators knew they had their man, but they still needed to understand the scope of who they were dealing with. Further investigation into Brian's background revealed a pattern of violence that painted a chilling picture of escalation. Records showed Brian had over 60 contacts with law enforcement officers throughout his young life. He had been involved in multiple domestic violence incidents that resulted in injuries to victims. 2 wives, 2 girlfriends, all had experienced his capacity for brutality. For Brian Pennington, beating women wasn't something new or unprecedented. It was a pattern of behavior that had been building towards something catastrophic. The revelation about Brian's history of domestic violence cast his wife Jessica's initial alibi in a different light. When detectives first interviewed her, she had seemed nervous, young, naive. She insisted her husband had been home with her during the entire time frame of the attack. But investigators suspected she was lying to protect him, possibly out of fear of what he might do to her if she told the truth. Jessica was only 20 years old with 2 young children. She had experienced Brian's violence firsthand and knew what he was capable of when crossed. Her initial lie wasn't born of loyalty, but of terror. She understood that cooperating with police could put her own life in danger. When investigators approached Jessica separately, away from her husband's presence, they were able to get her to open up about the truth. They explained to her how severely beaten Marty had been, how close she had come to dying, and how important it was for justice to be served. The human side of Jessica responded to this appeal. In a breakthrough moment for the case, Jessica broke down and admitted she had lied. Brian had not been home with her during the time of the attack. In fact, she revealed that her husband had a history of assaulting and threatening her as well. Her false alibi had been given out of fear, but learning about the extent of Marty's injuries helped her find the courage to tell the truth. Jessica's admission transformed her from a hostile witness protecting her abuser into one of the prosecution's most important allies. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing that Brian had no alibi for the morning of the attack, and that his pattern of violence against women extended far beyond what happened to Marty. As the case against Brian Pennington solidified, investigators felt confident they could secure a conviction. The DNA evidence was ironclad. Marty's identification was clear and unwavering. Jessica's recanted testimony eliminated Brian's alibi. The scratches on his face corroborated a physical struggle. Everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion, but the question that haunted everyone involved in the case remained unanswered. Why had Brian Pennington decided to brutally attack a woman who had hired him, paid him fairly, and treated him with respect? There had been no theft from Marty's home. Money and valuables were left untouched. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no history of conflict or disagreement between them. The randomness of the violence was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. If Brian could attack Marty without any apparent motive, then no one who had ever hired him or interacted with him was truly safe. The realization sent shockwaves through the community and raised uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people we invite into our homes and lives. For Marty's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and continued anguish. Relief that the monster who had nearly killed their loved one was behind bars. Anguish over the senseless nature of the crime and the long road to recovery that still lay ahead. The physical healing was only the beginning. The emotional and psychological trauma would take much longer to address. Marty herself faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life from the ground up. The brain injury had affected her balance, her vision, her hearing, her memory, and her ability to process information normally. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and concentration. The strong, capable woman who had been known for her reliability and competence now struggled with basic functions, yet even as she fought to regain her physical abilities, Marty demonstrated the same determination that had kept her alive through the attack. With the support of her family and medical team, she began the slow process of recovery, knowing that her survival and her willingness to testify would be crucial to ensuring Brian Pennington faced justice for his crimes. The legal proceedings that followed would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. Brian Pennington was charged with attempted first-degree murder, and the prosecution was determined to see him serve the maximum sentence allowed under law. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but in the American justice system, even the most clear-cut cases can take unexpected turns. As preparations for trial began, the prosecution team faced a critical decision about how to present their case. The DNA evidence on Pennington's genes was powerful, but they knew defense attorneys would try to create reasonable doubt wherever possible. The lack of a clear motive remained problematic, giving the defense room to argue that perhaps someone else had committed the crime. Marty's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The woman who had once been known for her sharp mind and quick wit now struggled with basic cognitive functions. Her speech was sometimes unclear, her memory had gaps, and her physical coordination remained impaired. The prosecution worried whether she would be strong enough to testify and whether a jury would find her testimony credible given her brain injury. But Marty possessed something that no amount of physical trauma could destroy: an unshakable determination to see justice done. She worked tirelessly with speech therapists and physical rehabilitation specialists, driven by the knowledge that her testimony could be the key to putting her attacker behind bars. Her children watched in amazement as their mother fought to reclaim pieces of herself that had been stolen in those terrible minutes in her basement. The preliminary hearing arrived with tremendous anticipation and anxiety. This would be the first time Marty would face her attacker in a courtroom setting, and no one knew how she would react. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the prosecution failed to convince the judge there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, Pennington would walk free. When Pennington was brought into the courtroom, the contrast was stark. He sat alone on his side of the room, with no family members present to support him. Not even his mother had come. He stared straight ahead, showing no emotion, until Marty entered the courtroom. Only then did his head turn, his eyes following her slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand. Those who witnessed that moment described it as chilling. Pennington's expression seemed to convey disbelief that his victim was not only alive, but walking into court to testify against him. The ghost he thought he had created was very much real and very much determined to see him pay for what he had done. Marty's testimony was powerful in its simplicity. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had endured, her identification of Pennington was clear and unwavering. She looked directly at him as she spoke, showing a courage that inspired everyone in the courtroom. Her voice may have been weaker than before, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Jessica Pennington took the stand. Her decision to tell the truth about her husband's whereabouts that morning was crucial, but it came at great personal cost. She knew that by testifying against him, she was putting herself and her children at risk of retaliation. Yet she found the strength to do what was right. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, but as the case moved forward, unexpected developments began to emerge. Pennington's defense team, recognizing the strength of the evidence against their client, began exploring the possibility of a plea agreement. The prospect of facing a jury with DNA evidence, victim identification, and witness testimony seemed daunting even to experienced defense attorneys. Negotiations between the prosecution and defense stretched on for months. The central question was how much time Pennington would serve in prison. The prosecution wanted to ensure he would be locked away for as long as legally possible, while the defense sought to minimize his sentence. For Marty and her family, the uncertainty was agonizing. Eventually, both sides reached an agreement. Pennington would plead guilty to the charges against him in exchange for a sentence of 28.5 years in prison. For the prosecution, it guaranteed a significant prison term without the uncertainty of a jury trial. For Marty, it meant she wouldn't have to endure the grueling process of a full trial and could begin to find some closure. But even this resolution would not come without drama. On the day of sentencing, as family members prepared to deliver victim impact statements, Pennington shocked everyone by attempting to withdraw his guilty plea. After weeks of accepting responsibility for his actions, he suddenly claimed the pressure was too much and the sentence too long. The judge was having none of it. Pennington's reasons for wanting to withdraw his plea were deemed insufficient, and the sentencing proceeded as planned. One by one, Marty's family members stood before the court to tell Pennington exactly how his actions had affected their lives. Her teenage daughter's statement was particularly powerful. She looked directly at Pennington as she spoke about the trauma of seeing her mother in the hospital, about the fear that had consumed their family, about the strength they had found in each other. Even though Pennington refused to look at her, she knew he was hearing every word. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marty herself stood before the man who had tried to kill her. Her voice was steady as she spoke about his betrayal of her trust, about the pain he had caused not just to her, but to everyone who loved her. She asked him the question that had haunted her since that terrible morning. "Why did you do this to me?" Pennington's response was silence. Even given the opportunity to explain his actions, to show some remorse, to offer some understanding of what had driven him to such violence, he chose to say nothing. That silence spoke volumes about the kind of person he truly was. The judge sentenced Brian Pennington to 28.5 years in the Kansas state prison system. He would have to serve at least a significant portion of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. For a man who had lived only 26 years, the prospect of spending more time behind bars than he had spent as a free man was sobering. Today, Marty Hill continues her recovery, forever changed, but never broken by what happened to her. The scars on her neck serve as a constant reminder of how close she came to death, but they also represent her incredible survival. She has returned to kickboxing, pushing herself physically as part of her ongoing rehabilitation. The woman who once weighed 97 pounds and was known as dynamite in a small package has proven that some forces of nature cannot be extinguished. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Brian Pennington wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone Marty knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home. That betrayal of trust makes his crime even more heinous, and her survival even more remarkable. The question of motive may never be fully answered. Pennington's silence has left his victim and her family without the closure that understanding might bring. But perhaps that's fitting. Some acts of violence are so senseless, so devoid of rational explanation, that trying to understand them is futile. What matters is that justice was served, that a dangerous predator was removed from society, and that a remarkable woman found the strength to survive and rebuild her life. In the end, this case reminds us all to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to remember that sometimes the greatest threats come from those we least suspect. The stranger you know may be the most dangerous stranger of all. In 1979, on what seemed like a perfect summer evening, a 9-year-old girl's life changed forever. One moment she was watching television and laughing at a comedy show. The next, she was learning that someone wanted her entire family dead. This is the story of the Busby family, whose year of terror began with a single shotgun blast that shattered more than just a car window. It destroyed their sense of safety, their home, and forced them into a life they never imagined possible. Picture this. It's August 31st, 1979, the Friday before Labor Day weekend. The Busby family is spending their evening in the driveway, painting a car while the summer sun sets over Cape Cod. 9-year-old Silyn Busby has no idea this will be the last normal moment of her childhood. Her father, John Busby, is getting ready for his midnight shift as a police sergeant in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Everything seems ordinary, peaceful even, but in small towns like Falmouth, ordinary can become extraordinary in the span of a heartbeat. And sometimes, that heartbeat stops altogether. John Busby wasn't just any police officer. He was the kind of cop who didn't care about your connections, your family name, or how much money you had. If you broke the law, you faced the consequences, period. This unwavering commitment to justice had earned him respect from honest citizens and hatred from those who thought they were above the law. Unfortunately for the Busby family, one of those people had decided that John Busby needed to be silenced permanently. As John drove to work that night, less than half a mile from his house, a car pulled up behind him. At first, it seemed like any other vehicle on the road, but then it pulled alongside his Volkswagen, matching his speed. In that moment, John realized this wasn't a normal traffic situation. Someone was hunting him. The blast from the shotgun tore through the driver's side window with devastating force. The impact ripped through John's face, destroying his lower jaw and leaving him barely conscious. But in those crucial seconds before darkness took hold, he managed to do something that would save his family's lives. He wrote 2 words that would change everything, not an accident. John Busby knew instantly who wanted him dead. He'd crossed paths with dangerous people before, but one name stood out above all others. Someone who had a reputation for making problems disappear, sometimes along with the people who caused them. Someone who had been suspected in multiple disappearances and murders but had never been held accountable. Someone whose favorite saying was, "I smell smoke," which wasn't a comment about the weather, but a thinly veiled threat that your property might mysteriously catch fire. Meanwhile, back at the Busby house, 9-year-old Silyn was settling in for what she thought would be a normal evening. She was watching Benny Hill on television, laughing at the comedy sketches, completely unaware that her father was fighting for his life just minutes away. Her mother Polly was studying to become a nurse. Her 2 older brothers, Eric and Sean, were probably getting ready for bed. Their cousin Kelly, who helped with babysitting duties, was keeping an eye on things. Then came the knock at the door that shattered their world. When Silyn heard someone crying or screaming, she initially thought it was coming from the television. But as the sounds continued, she realized something was terribly wrong. She came out of her room to find her father's colleague, Rick Smith, in uniform, speaking to her mother who was crying and screaming, repeatedly saying no, 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 and trying to push him away. The confusion was overwhelming. Nobody was explaining what had happened. There was just chaos, fear, and the terrible realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Silyn stood there, asking what was happening. But the adults were too consumed by their own shock and panic to notice her. What Cylin didn't know yet was that her father was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to breathe on his own, but very much alive and very much aware of who had tried to kill him. What she also didn't know was that this shooting wasn't just about her father. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge certain people in their small town. And if those people were willing to shoot a police officer, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to finish the job by eliminating his family. The note John managed to write in his hospital bed contained more than just the words, "Not an accident." He also wrote, "Polly and the kids are not safe." This wasn't the rambling of a man in shock. This was the clear, calculated warning of someone who understood exactly what kind of enemy they were dealing with. In Falmouth, Massachusetts, there was one person everyone knew you didn't cross. Melvin Rain was in the trash hauling business, which might sound harmless enough, but his methods of dealing with competition and problems were anything but ordinary. He was a convicted arsonist with a reputation for getting even with people by sneaking around at night and burning their property, houses, cars, businesses. If Melvin had a problem with you, something you owned might mysteriously go up in flames, but arson was just the beginning. Melvin was also suspected of murder. Not one murder, not two, but 3 separate cases where people had disappeared or turned up dead under suspicious circumstances. His own wife, Wanda, had vanished in 1971 after he claimed to have dropped her off at a bus station. She was never seen again. A teenage boy who had been dating a girl Melvin was interested in was found shot to death in a cranberry bog directly across from Melvin's house. A 17-year-old former employee who was set to testify against Melvin in a grand jury investigation got on a ferry to Martha's Vineyard but never got off. In each case, Melvin walked free. The pattern was always the same. People who crossed him or posed a threat to him seemed to disappear or meet unfortunate ends. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. Or perhaps there were people in positions of power who were too afraid to go after him. This was the man John Busby had been willing to confront when others wouldn't. This was the man who had decided that a police officer who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated needed to be eliminated. And this was the man who now posed an ongoing threat to a family that included 3 young children. Back at the hospital, doctors were working frantically to save John's life. The damage was so severe that they had never seen anything like it. His face was unrecognizable. His jaw was gone, and he couldn't speak, breathe, or eat without mechanical assistance. But he was alive, and he was determined to stay that way for one reason: his family needed him to survive so he could protect them from what was coming next. Because this story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the Busby family tried to process what had happened, the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had specifically targeted John Busby for elimination, and that same someone would likely not be satisfied with a failed attempt. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the shooting, the Busby house was surrounded by law enforcement. Squad cars filled the driveway. Officers with rifles took positions around the property. The message was clear. This family was now under siege, and everyone understood that the danger was far from over. For 9-year-old Cylin, the transformation was jarring. One day, she was a normal kid living in a normal house on Cape Cod. The next day, armed guards were stationed outside her bedroom window. Police officers followed her to school, sat outside her classroom, and watched her eat lunch. Every movement was monitored. Every person who came near her was scrutinized. The psychological impact on the children was immediate and profound. At school, word spread quickly about what had happened. Some children were curious, others were frightened, and many were simply told by their parents to stay away from the Busby kids. Silen found herself sitting alone at lunch tables, excluded from playground games, and treated like a walking target. One particularly cruel classmate even told her directly that everyone knew someone was trying to kill her family and that they might be next. The family's home became a fortress. An 8-foot fence was erected around the property. A sophisticated alarm system was installed. Windows were covered. Doors remained locked at all times. The family dog, Tiger, was given away and replaced with Max, a trained attack dog whose sole purpose was to eliminate any threat to John Busby or his family. Max wasn't a pet. He was a weapon with 4 legs and a set of teeth designed to kill. But perhaps the most unsettling change was in John himself. When he finally came home from the hospital months later, he was a different person entirely. The injuries to his face were so severe that he was barely recognizable. His jaw had been reconstructed, but the damage went far beyond the physical. The man who had once been playful and affectionate with his children now seemed emotionally distant. The father who used to roughhouse and tell jokes had been replaced by someone who was constantly vigilant, always watching, always planning. The financial burden on the family was crushing. John's compensation for being shot in the line of duty was $200 per week, hardly enough to support a family of 5, let alone a family that needed round-the-clock security. The town of Falmouth was spending enormous amounts of money on police protection, and it was becoming clear that this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, the investigation into the shooting was going nowhere. Despite John's clear indication of who was responsible, despite the obvious motive, and despite Melvin Rain's history of violence, no arrests were made, no charges were filed, no justice was served. It was as if the shooting had never happened, at least from an official standpoint. This lack of action wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. If the police couldn't or wouldn't go after the person who had tried to murder one of their own officers, what protection could they really offer his family? The Busbys were living in a state of constant fear, never knowing when the next attempt on their lives might come. John's anger was building to dangerous levels. In his hospital bed, he had initially focused on survival and recovery. But as the months passed and it became clear that no official justice would be forthcoming, his thoughts turned to a different kind of solution. He began to contemplate taking matters into his own hands. The idea of hunting down Melvin Rain and finishing what had been started that night in August became more than just a fantasy. It became a plan. The family was trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. They couldn't live normally because of the constant threat. They couldn't rely on the justice system because it had failed them completely. They couldn't even trust their own community because too many people were either afraid of Melvin Rain or somehow connected to him. As winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, it became increasingly clear that something had to change. The Busby family couldn't continue living as prisoners in their own home. The town couldn't continue spending money on protection that might not even be effective. And John couldn't continue to heal, physically or emotionally, while surrounded by daily reminders of the violence that had been done to him. The solution, when it finally came, was as drastic as it was necessary. If the Busby family couldn't be safe in Falmouth, Massachusetts, then they would have to leave Falmouth, Massachusetts, not just for a vacation or a temporary relocation, but permanently. They would have to disappear completely, leaving behind everything they had ever known and starting over somewhere new, somewhere safe, somewhere that Melvin Rain couldn't find them. But leaving meant more than just packing their belongings and driving away. It meant abandoning their identities, their history, their connections to the community where they had lived their entire lives. It meant the children would have to learn to lie about their past, create false stories about why they had moved, and never speak the truth about what had happened to their father. Most importantly, it meant that John Busby would have to make a choice. He could stay and pursue the violent revenge that was consuming his thoughts, or he could prioritize his family's safety and disappear with them into whatever new life awaited them far from Cape Cod. The decision would define not just the next chapter of their story, but the rest of their lives. In the end, the choice was made for them. The town of Falmouth, faced with mounting security costs and no resolution in sight, made it clear that the easiest solution was for the Busby family to simply disappear, rather than continue the expensive protection detail or pursue justice against the person responsible. It was more convenient for everyone involved if the victims just went away. The message was unmistakable. It's easier for you to live somewhere else than to live here. We'll save money, and you'll be on your way. After everything John had sacrificed in service to his community, after taking a shotgun blast to the face in the line of duty, this was his reward. The town that he had protected was essentially telling him that his family's safety was less important than their budget. So in the summer of 1980, almost exactly 1 year after the shooting, the Busby family began their exodus from Cape Cod. They loaded their belongings into a car and started driving south, with no clear destination except somewhere safe. They had pulled the names of towns out of a hat, places where Polly might find work as a nurse, and Tennessee had won the lottery of their desperation. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. They were given a police escort to the Bourne Bridge, the boundary that separates Cape Cod from the mainland. It was both a gesture of respect and a clear message, goodbye and good riddance. You're not our problem anymore, as they crossed that bridge, leaving behind everything they had ever known. The children understood that they weren't just moving to a new town. They were entering a witness protection program of their own design, one where they would have to reinvent themselves completely. The people they had been, the Busby family of Falmouth, Massachusetts, were disappearing forever. The drive south felt like descending into hell. As they traveled further from the familiar coastline of Cape Cod, the temperature rose and the landscape became increasingly foreign. For children who had grown up with ocean breezes and familiar neighborhoods, the rural expanses of the American South felt like exile to another planet. When they finally reached their destination in Tennessee, the culture shock was immediate and overwhelming. Everything was different. The accents, the food, the social customs, even the way people looked at strangers. The Busby children, with their New England sensibilities and traumatic baggage, stood out like beacons in their new community. But standing out was exactly what they couldn't afford to do. So they began the painful process of transformation. Silyn got a perm and started practicing a Southern accent. She learned to apply lip gloss and dress like the local girls. Most importantly, she learned to lie about their past, about why they had moved, about what was wrong with her father's face, about everything that mattered. John grew a massive beard that obscured most of the damage to his face. He found work on a farm, spending his days splitting wood and doing physical labor that seemed to help process some of his rage. The repetitive motion of swinging an axe through logs became a form of therapy, a way to channel the violence that still simmered inside him. For a while, it seemed like the healing might actually work. The family began to find their rhythm in this new place. The constant fear that had defined their existence in Massachusetts gradually faded. The children started making friends. Polly found work as a nurse. They were still looking over their shoulders, still careful about who they trusted. But life began to feel somewhat normal again. But John's anger hadn't disappeared. It had just gone underground. Every few months, he would have to return to Boston for reconstructive surgery, and each trip forced him to confront what had been done to him. When he shaved his beard for these procedures, he would see the full extent of his injuries in the mirror, and the rage would come flooding back. During one of these trips, his uncle presented him with a gift, a rifle with a scope and a silencer, everything he would need to hunt down Melvin Rain and finish what had been started that night in 1979. For a moment, John was tempted. The weapon represented everything he had dreamed about during those dark months of recovery. But something had changed. The man who had once fantasized about revenge had been replaced by someone who understood that his family's peace was worth more than his personal vengeance. He looked at the gun, wrote a note to his uncle, and walked away. "Thank you for your effort," he wrote. "I won't need it." That decision marked a turning point. When John returned to Tennessee, he told his family he was done with surgery, done with trips to Boston, done with living in the past. They were going to embrace their new life and move forward as the people they had become, not the people they used to be. Years passed. The children grew up, went to college, started families of their own. The trauma never fully disappeared, but it became manageable. The family had survived not just the original attack, but the year of terror that followed and the complete upheaval of their lives. Then, in 2003, 24 years after the shooting, something unexpected happened. The Rain family had started turning on each other, fighting over money and spilling family secrets to the police. John Rain, Melvin's brother, finally came clean about what had happened that night in August 1979. The confession provided the vindication that John Busby had been seeking for more than 2 decades. His instincts had been correct. Melvin Rain had indeed been the one who ordered the hit. John Rain described how his brother had sat in the back seat of their car with a ski mask and a shotgun, waiting for the perfect moment to fire through John's window. But vindication came with a bitter irony. By the time the confession was made, the statute of limitations had expired. No charges could be filed. No justice could be served through the legal system. Melvin Rain would never face trial for attempted murder. In a way, though, justice had been served by other means. Melvin Rain was confined to a state institution, suffering from what was reported to be Pick's disease, a form of dementia that affects the brain. The man who had once terrorized an entire community was now powerless, his mind deteriorating, his capacity for violence neutralized by his own failing health. For the Busby family, the confession brought closure of a different kind. They had built new lives far from Cape Cod, lives that were fuller and richer than what they had left behind. Silin became a successful author, writing books for children and drawing on her experiences to help others understand resilience and survival. John and Polly found peace in their rural Tennessee home, surrounded by the natural beauty that had helped heal their wounds. The year they disappeared had ended, but the people they became in its aftermath had endured. They had proven that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding ways to thrive despite the worst that life can throw at you. They had learned that sometimes running away isn't cowardice. It's the bravest thing you can do to protect the people you love. Looking back, Silin would say that she couldn't imagine being anyone other than who that terrible year had made her. The trauma had touched every part of her life, but it had also given her strength, perspective, and an appreciation for safety and normalcy that most people never develop. She had lived through something that should have destroyed her family, and instead, it had ultimately made them stronger. The Busby family's story is a testament to the power of choosing life over revenge, healing over hatred, and love over fear. They disappeared from one life and created another, proving that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is simply to refuse to let them define your future. In the end, they had won, not through violence or legal justice, but through the simple act of surviving and building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The year they disappeared had become the foundation for decades of peace, love, and happiness that followed. And perhaps that's the most powerful victory of all. In a quiet military town along California's coast, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Louise Day simply vanished without a trace. But this wasn't your typical missing person case. For over 20 years, nobody even knew she was gone. The year was 1981. Ronald Reagan had just become president. MTV launched its first broadcast, and in the small town of Seaside, California, a young girl was about to disappear from existence entirely. Not just physically, but from all records, all memories, all traces of her life. What makes Mary Day's case so haunting isn't just that she vanished. It's that her own family never reported her missing. They never called the police, never filed a report, never even told the neighbors. For 2 decades, it was as if Mary Louise Day had never existed at all. This story begins not in 1981, but in 2002, when a woman named Sherry Calgaro walked into the Seaside Police Department with a question that would unravel one of the strangest missing person cases in California history. Sherry was looking for her sister Mary, who had disappeared when Sherry was just 10 years old. Detective Joe Bertina took the case, expecting it to be routine. Missing persons cases from the 80s were challenging, but not impossible. What he discovered instead was something far more disturbing. There was no record of Mary Louise Day anywhere. No social security activity, no driver's license, no credit cards, no employment records, nothing. It was as if she had simply been erased from existence. But the real mystery wasn't just where Mary had gone. It was why her own mother and stepfather had never bothered to look for her. The Day family had never been stable. Mary, along with her sisters Kathy and Sherry, had bounced between foster homes throughout their childhood. Their mother, Charlotte, struggled to care for them, and the girls were frequently separated. Eventually, Charlotte married William Hoole, a military man stationed at Fort Ord, and the family seemed to settle into a more permanent arrangement. But underneath the surface of this military family, something dark was brewing. Sherry remembered visiting her birth family years after Mary's disappearance, eager to reconnect with her sisters. When she asked about Mary, the response was chilling. Her sister Kathy pulled her aside and whispered urgently, telling her they weren't allowed to talk about Mary. The family had been instructed never to mention her name again. According to Sherry and Kathy, their parents had simply told them that Mary had run away. But running away was one thing. Never being reported missing was quite another. Detective Bertina began piecing together Mary's final days through interviews with her surviving family members. What emerged was a picture of an increasingly volatile household, where Mary seemed to be bearing the brunt of her stepfather's anger. The last time anyone remembered seeing Mary alive was during what appeared to be an ordinary evening at the family's home in Seaside. The family had gone out, leaving Mary and young Kathy at home alone. When they returned, they discovered their dog was sick and dying in the kitchen. William Hoole immediately accused Mary of poisoning the animal. According to Kathy's recollection, he flew into a rage, striking Mary so hard that blood ran from her mouth. That was the last time Kathy saw her sister alive. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to William and Charlotte, Mary simply ran away sometime during the night. They claimed she had done it before, so they weren't particularly concerned. But there were details that didn't add up. If Mary was a habitual runaway, why did William and Charlotte panic when they first discovered she was gone? Why did they never file a police report? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why did they continue collecting Mary's Social Security benefits long after she disappeared? As Detective Bertana dug deeper into the case, he discovered that the family had been receiving monthly checks due to Mary's biological father's death in an accident. These payments continued for years after Mary vanished, suggesting that her disappearance might have been financially motivated. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Bertana decided to search the family's former home in Seaside. He brought Kathy along, hoping her childhood memories might provide clues about what had happened to her sister. Kathy led detectives to a specific area of the backyard, where she remembered being forbidden to play. According to her recollection, William had explicitly told the children to stay away from one particular corner of the yard after Mary disappeared. When cadaver dogs were brought in to search the property, they immediately alerted to that exact spot. The handlers were confident that human remains had been buried there at some point. Investigators began digging, their hearts pounding as they imagined finally finding Mary's body. Instead, they found something else entirely. A small child's shoe, buried in the dirt where the dogs had indicated the presence of human remains. But there was no body. The dog handlers were puzzled but certain. Their animals didn't make mistakes like this. If they had alerted to human remains, then human remains had definitely been there. The only explanation was that the body had been moved. This discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a potential homicide. Detective Bertana was now convinced that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981 and that her body had been buried in the family's backyard before being relocated to an unknown location. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The family's refusal to report Mary missing, their continued collection of her Social Security benefits, the forbidden area of the backyard, and the cadaver dog's alert all painted a picture of a cover-up that had lasted more than 20 years. But just as the case seemed to be building toward arrests, something completely unexpected happened. Something that would throw the entire investigation into chaos and leave everyone involved questioning everything they thought they knew about Mary Louise Day. In November 2003, police in Phoenix, Arizona, made a routine traffic stop. The vehicle had stolen plates, and when officers ran identification checks on the passengers, one name jumped out at them immediately. The woman sitting in that truck claimed to be Mary Louise Day. The news from Phoenix hit Detective Bertana like a lightning bolt. After months of building a murder case, after bringing in cadaver dogs and digging up backyards, after interviewing family members who seemed to be hiding a terrible secret, a woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day had just materialized 700 miles away. But the timing was more than suspicious. This woman had obtained her Arizona identification card just 3 weeks earlier, right in the middle of the active homicide investigation. It was as if someone had been watching the case unfold and decided to take action. When Bertana flew to Phoenix to meet this mysterious woman, he found someone who looked like she could be Mary Day. She was the right age, had similar features, and seemed to know basic details about the family. But something felt off about her story. The woman, who Bertana began calling Phoenix Mary in his reports, claimed she had run away from home as a teenager and had been living under the radar ever since. She said she had survived by using fake names and staying off the grid, which would explain why there were no official records of her existence for over 20 years. But when Bertina pressed her for details about that final night in Seaside, her memories seemed foggy and inconsistent. She remembered some kind of confrontation with William, and she recalled bleeding. But she couldn't remember anything about the sick dog that Kathy had described in such vivid detail. This was troubling to investigators. The dog incident was central to Kathy's account of Mary's final hours. If this woman was really Mary, how could she forget such a traumatic event? Phoenix Mary seemed increasingly frustrated with the questioning. During one phone conversation, she challenged the detective directly, asking how he would be able to prove who she was even if he found her body. It was an odd thing to say, and it only deepened Bertina's suspicions. The detective was convinced this woman was an imposter, but he needed proof. The solution was simple enough: a DNA test that would definitively determine whether she was Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. Bertina was confident the test would expose the deception. There was no way this woman's DNA would match Charlotte's. Except it did. The results came back positive. Phoenix Mary was indeed Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. The case was officially closed, and after more than 20 years, Mary Louise Day had apparently been found alive. But for many people involved in the investigation, the DNA results only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Sherry Calgaro, eager to reconnect with her long-lost sister, invited Phoenix Mary to move in with her. Finally, after decades of wondering what had happened to Mary, the family could be reunited. Yet, almost immediately, Sherry began noticing things that didn't seem right. The woman claiming to be her sister spoke with a pronounced Southern accent, which seemed strange considering Mary had spent her childhood moving between California and various military bases. Phoenix Mary also claimed she had abandoned her real name years ago and had been going by Monica Devereaux. Sherry found magazines in the house addressed to this name, which seemed to support the story. But there were other details that bothered her. The woman didn't remember their father's inheritance, money that all the Day children were supposed to collect when they turned 18. This had been their shared dream as children, their ticket to freedom from the troubled household. How could Mary have forgotten something so important? Even more unsettling, she didn't remember the secret code word that she and Sherry had shared as children. They had called it Mohawk, and it was supposed to be their special signal if they ever needed to find each other again. Kathy, Mary's other sister, had an even stronger reaction when she met Phoenix Mary. Her gut instinct told her immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't the sister she remembered. The situation became even more bizarre when Phoenix Mary sent an email to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity. She seemed to be suggesting that she wasn't really Mary Day after all. Despite these red flags, the case remained officially closed. The DNA evidence was considered conclusive, and there didn't seem to be any compelling reason to reopen the investigation. But the story was far from over. In 2008, Steve Cercone, now Seaside's police chief, received another unexpected phone call. Investigators at Fort Ord, the former military base where the Hoole family had lived, were conducting an unrelated search with cadaver dogs when they made a startling discovery. The dogs had alerted to another location where the Hoole family had lived, a house they had moved to shortly after Mary's disappearance. Once again, the dogs indicated that human remains had been present at the site. This suggested something even more disturbing than investigators had previously imagined. Had Mary's body been moved not once, but twice were the Hooles systematically relocating evidence as they moved from base to base. Cercone felt compelled to reopen the investigation, even though the case had been officially closed. Too many questions remained unanswered. He hired Mark Clark, a retired homicide detective from nearby Salinas, to take a fresh look at all the evidence. Clark's review of the case files convinced him that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981 and that Phoenix Mary was an elaborate imposter. He developed a theory that seemed to explain all the inconsistencies, though he admitted it was somewhat far-fetched. Clark believed that Charlotte Houle had given birth to another daughter years before Mary, a child she had given up for adoption and kept secret from the rest of the family. When the murder investigation began heating up in 2003, Clark theorized William and Charlotte had reached out to this secret daughter and convinced her to assume Mary's identity. The motive, according to Clark, was the inheritance money that Mary would have been entitled to collect. By that time, with accumulated interest, the sum had grown to approximately $60,000. This theory would explain Phoenix Mary's Southern accent if she had been raised in a different part of the country. It would explain why she didn't remember family secrets or important details from Mary's childhood. And it would explain the convenient timing of her appearance, just as the murder investigation was gaining momentum. Clark also pointed to William Houle's own words during his police interview. The stepfather had come tantalizingly close to confessing, saying that while he hadn't killed Mary, the demon inside him might have done it. In Clark's opinion, this was as close to an admission of guilt as they were likely to get. The retired detective believed that William and Charlotte had torn up Mary's pictures, thrown away her clothes, and told their other children never to speak her name again because they were covering up a murder. The fact that they had continued collecting her Social Security benefits for years only strengthened his conviction that this was a premeditated crime. But Clark's theory, while compelling, remained just that, a theory. He had no concrete proof that Phoenix Mary was an imposter, and the DNA evidence seemed to contradict his hypothesis. The case remained in limbo, officially closed, but unofficially still generating doubts and questions among those who had worked on it. In 2017, a new detective took charge of the Mary Day case. Detective Judy Veloz approached the investigation with fresh eyes and a determination to separate fact from speculation. She wasn't interested in theories or hunches. She wanted hard evidence. Veloz began by re-examining the physical evidence that had convinced so many people that a murder had taken place. That child's shoe found in the backyard, for instance. When she held it in her palm, she realized it was extremely small, far too small for a 13-year-old girl of Mary's height and build. The shoe that had seemed like such damning evidence suddenly appeared to be nothing more than a coincidence. She also took a closer look at the DNA results that had closed the case in 2003. Additional testing had been conducted over the years, and the results were consistent. Phoenix Mary's DNA matched not only Charlotte Houle, but also Mary's biological father. The genetic evidence was overwhelming. But Veloz wanted to hear from Mary herself. The woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day was now living in Missouri, battling late-stage cancer. Her health was failing rapidly, and Veloz knew this might be her last chance to get answers. The interview lasted 90 minutes, and what Veloz heard convinced her that this was indeed the real Mary Day. The woman was able to fill in gaps in her story that had previously seemed suspicious. She explained that she had started calling herself Monica shortly after running away because she didn't want police to track her down and return her to William and Charlotte. Mary also introduced Veloz to a crucial figure from her past, a woman named Maury Kimmel, who had taken Mary in when she was just 15 years old. Kimmel remembered Mary as naive and childlike, someone who had clearly been through trauma but was trying to survive on her own. Kimmel's testimony helped explain many of the inconsistencies that had fueled the imposter theories. Mary had lived with Kimmel's family for about a year, one of the few stable periods in her adult life. But one day, she simply disappeared again, leaving Kimmel heartbroken and wondering what had happened to the young woman she had tried to help. The investigation revealed that Mary had spent decades moving from city to city, living on the margins of society and struggling with alcoholism. This transient lifestyle explained why there were so few official records of her existence. She had deliberately avoided creating a paper trail that might lead authorities back to her childhood home. Velaz also solved the mystery of why Mary had suddenly obtained that Arizona identification card in 2003. She had needed surgery to remove her gallbladder and required state assistance to pay for the procedure. A local nonprofit organization had helped her track down her birth certificate so she could get proper identification in her real name. The Southern accent that had bothered so many people also had a logical explanation. Mary had spent time in various parts of the country during her decades of wandering, and speech patterns can change over time, especially for someone who had been drinking heavily for years. As for that mysterious email Mary had sent to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity, Velaz discovered that Mary had sent a follow-up message trying to clarify her meaning. She explained that she had been confused and wasn't sure what she was trying to say in the original email. This was consistent with someone struggling with severe alcoholism and the cognitive effects of long-term substance abuse. The smoking gun in Velaz's investigation came from an unexpected source. One of Maury Kimmel's relatives had kept a photograph of Mary, taken at least a year after her alleged murder in 1981. This picture clearly showed Mary as a teenager, alive and well, long after she was supposed to have been killed. Velaz submitted this photograph to TrueFace, a state-of-the-art facial recognition company. Their algorithms compared the teenage Mary in the photograph with later pictures of Phoenix Mary, and the results were conclusive. There was a 99% probability that they were the same person. With this evidence in hand, Velaz submitted her final report and officially closed the Mary Day investigation for good. After decades of speculation and conspiracy theories, the case was finally resolved. Mary Louise Day had not been murdered in 1981. She had run away from an abusive home and spent the rest of her life trying to survive on her own terms. 9 days after Velaz interviewed her, Mary Day died from cancer. There was no funeral. The woman who had been at the center of one of California's most bizarre missing person cases passed away quietly. Her story finally told, but even with the case officially closed, some people remained unconvinced. Mark Clark, the retired detective who had developed the imposter theory, admitted that Velaz's report made him question his own investigation, but he couldn't entirely shake his suspicions. Steve Cercone, the former police chief, also found himself leaning toward accepting that Phoenix Mary was indeed the real Mary Louise Day after seeing the photographic evidence. But he remained certain that the cadaver dogs had detected something significant at both burial sites. The truth is that we may never know exactly what happened in the Hoole household in 1981. The cadaver dogs don't lie, as their handlers repeatedly insisted. They detected human remains at 2 separate locations where the family had lived. But whose remains were they detecting? Perhaps William Hoole was responsible for another death that was never reported. Perhaps there were other victims whose stories have never been told. Or perhaps the dogs were detecting very old remains that had nothing to do with the Hoole family at all. What we do know is that Mary Louise Day survived her childhood ordeal and lived for 36 more years after supposedly being murdered. She never had an easy life, but she managed to survive on her own terms, far from the people who had failed to protect her as a child. The Mary Day case serves as a stark reminder of how the system can fail vulnerable children. Mary was bounced between foster homes, returned to an abusive household, and disappeared without anyone in authority noticing or caring. For 20 years, not a single official asked where she had gone. It also demonstrates how conspiracy theories can take on a life of their own. especially when they seemed to explain mysterious circumstances. The imposter theory was compelling because it accounted for so many odd details. But ultimately, it was wrong. In the end, Mary Louise Day's story is not one of murder and cover-up, but of survival against overwhelming odds. A 13-year-old girl found the courage to escape an impossible situation and built a life for herself, however difficult and imperfect it may have been. She deserved better from the adults who were supposed to care for her. She deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect her. But she found a way to survive, and that survival was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The mystery of what happened to Mary Day has finally been solved. She lived, she struggled, and she endured. And maybe, in its own way, that's the most important truth of all. When a young woman steps out for what seems like an ordinary evening with someone she trusts, the last thing anyone expects is for her to simply vanish without a trace. But sometimes the most routine moments become the beginning of something unthinkable. In October 2013, Milwaukee would witness exactly this kind of chilling disappearance, one that would grip the community and reveal disturbing secrets hiding in plain sight. This is the story of Kelly Dwyer, a vibrant 27-year-old whose sudden vanishing would expose a web of deception, dangerous behavior, and ultimately, a crime that shocked investigators to their core. What started as a missing person case would evolve into something far more sinister, involving disturbing evidence, a cadaver dog's alerts, and a man living a double life that nobody suspected. The night Kelly disappeared began like countless others. She was young, social, and exploring life in Milwaukee after moving there several years earlier. Working part-time as a nanny and at an athletic apparel store, Kelly had built a close-knit circle of friends and co-workers who knew her as someone you could count on. She was the type of person who never missed work without calling, never went offline for days, and always kept in touch with the people who mattered to her. That's why when Kelly failed to show up for her shift on October 12, 2013, alarm bells immediately started ringing. Her co-workers weren't just concerned, they were genuinely frightened. This wasn't like Kelly at all. She was attached to her phone, constantly posting on social media, always texting. But when they tried calling her, the phone went straight to voicemail. Her social media had gone completely silent. It was as if she had simply disappeared from the digital world entirely. By the time authorities became involved, Kelly had been missing for days. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Missing person flyers appeared everywhere overnight. Volunteers organized search parties. Local news picked up the story. There was something about Kelly's bright smile and infectious energy that resonated with people across Milwaukee. Parents looked at her photo and saw their own daughters. Friends recognized someone who could have been their best friend. But as investigators began piecing together Kelly's final hours, they discovered she had been living a life that was perhaps more complicated than many people realized. Kelly was active on several dating websites, meeting new people regularly. In an age of online dating and social networking, this wasn't unusual for a single woman in her 20s. What investigators found concerning, however, was how this lifestyle might have exposed her to potential dangers. The last confirmed sighting of Kelly alive came from security cameras at an upscale apartment building on Milwaukee's East Side. The footage showed her entering the building with a man she had been dating for about a year, Chris Zacco. They appeared relaxed, chatting casually as they walked through the lobby and stepped into the elevator. Kelly was gesturing with her hands in her typical animated fashion. They looked like any other couple ending a pleasant evening out. What made this footage so haunting was what it didn't show. While cameras clearly captured Kelly entering the building, there was no video of her ever leaving. In a high-security building with 28 surveillance cameras monitoring virtually every entrance and exit, Kelly Dwyer simply vanished. Chris Zacco told investigators that Kelly had left his 18th floor apartment around 9 o'clock the following morning. He claimed he heard the front door click shut behind her as she departed, but the security footage told a different story entirely. There was no image of Kelly exiting the building through any monitored entrance. For investigators, this discrepancy immediately made Zacco a person of interest. When detectives sat down with Zacco in his apartment, they found him surprisingly forthcoming about certain aspects of his relationship with Kelly. He described their connection as friends with benefits rather than anything serious or exclusive. He readily admitted they had used cocaine together that evening and engaged in sexual activity before both passing out on his couch. His casual demeanor when discussing these intimate details struck investigators as unusual for someone whose dating partner had just disappeared. But as the interview progressed, Zacco began deflecting attention away from himself and toward Kelly's other relationships. He mentioned that she was seeing multiple people, implying that one of these other men might be responsible for whatever had happened to her. This attempt to redirect suspicion only heightened investigators' focus on him. The search of Zacco's apartment, obtained through a warrant based on his admission of drug use, revealed more than just the cocaine and marijuana investigators expected to find. They discovered something that would change the entire trajectory of the case, disturbing videos and photographs of Kelly on Zacco's phone. The images showed her in what appeared to be distressing situations, including footage where she seemed to be struggling to breathe during intimate encounters. Even more troubling were photographs that appeared to show Kelly unconscious on Zacco's bed. While investigators couldn't definitively link these images to the night of her disappearance, they painted a disturbing picture of the relationship between Kelly and Zacco. The evidence suggested behavior that went far beyond what Kelly's friends knew about their connection. Perhaps the most significant discovery came when police brought in a cadaver dog named Molly to search the apartment. The specially trained canine alerted to multiple locations throughout Zacco's residence, including his bedroom, bathroom, hallway, and the parking garage where he kept his car. These alerts indicated the possible presence of decomposing human remains, transforming what had been a missing person investigation into a potential homicide case. The bathroom search revealed additional concerning evidence. The shower curtain had been torn down, with only the bent and damaged hooks remaining. According to Zacco's long-term girlfriend, Megan, who had been in the apartment just weeks earlier, this bathroom should have contained a shower curtain, decorative towels, and a small rug. All of these items were missing. What investigators found particularly significant was that Megan, who had been dating Zacco for over 3 years, knew nothing about his relationship with Kelly. While Kelly may have believed she was in a friends with benefits situation, she was actually unknowingly involved with a man who was maintaining a serious, long-term relationship with another woman. This deception added another layer of complexity to an already troubling case. The investigation revealed that Zacco had been living what amounted to a double life. To his girlfriend Megan, he was a committed partner in a multi-year relationship. To Kelly, he presented himself as someone available for casual dating. This pattern of deception extended beyond his personal relationships and into other aspects of his life that investigators were only beginning to uncover. As police continued processing the apartment, they identified one more missing item that would become crucial to their theory of the case. Megan told investigators about a large, padded travel golf bag that had been sitting in front of the television for weeks. It was silver-colored and approximately 2 to 2.5 feet wide, large enough that people had to step over it to access the bathroom. Like the shower curtain and bathroom accessories, this bag was now nowhere to be found. The implications were chilling. Investigators began to theorize that Zocco might have used this missing golf bag to transport Kelly's body out of the apartment building. The bag would have been large enough to contain her remains and could potentially explain how he managed to remove her from the building without being captured on any of the security cameras. But this theory raised as many questions as it answered. How could Zocco have moved such a large, heavy bag through the building without being detected? The security system was extensive, monitoring elevators, hallways, and entrances throughout the complex. Yet somehow, if their theory was correct, he had managed to remove Kelly's body without leaving any video evidence of the act. The investigation was about to take an even darker turn as police prepared to examine Zocco's movements in the days following Kelly's disappearance. And what they discovered would only deepen the mystery surrounding her fate. The mystery deepened as investigators began tracking Zocco's movements through security footage and electronic records. What they discovered was a carefully choreographed series of actions that suggested someone desperately trying to conceal a crime. The timeline that emerged painted a disturbing picture of the hours and days following Kelly's disappearance. On the morning after Kelly was last seen, cameras captured Zocco leaving his apartment building at 10:08 a.m. This was significant because it coincided exactly with when Kelly's phone went completely dead. Her device had been active throughout the night, but at that precise moment, all electronic activity ceased. Investigators believed this wasn't a coincidence. Either her phone had been deliberately destroyed, powered down permanently, or thrown into water, possibly the nearby Milwaukee River, just 16 minutes later. Security cameras showed Zocco returning to the building's parking garage. But this time, he was captured standing by the trunk of his car, and investigators noticed something crucial in the footage. There appeared to be a small gray or silver object visible above the trunk level inside his vehicle. The size and shape were consistent with the missing travel golf bag that his girlfriend had described. The cadaver dog Molly had alerted not only throughout Zocco's apartment, but also on his car, specifically the trunk area, door handles, and interior. For investigators, this was compelling evidence that Kelly's remains had been transported in that vehicle. The timeline was becoming clearer, even if the full picture remained incomplete. Over the next 8 hours, security footage revealed Zocco making multiple trips to and from his apartment, systematically loading items into his car. His behavior appeared methodical, almost ritualistic, as he prepared for what investigators believed was the disposal of evidence. Finally, at 6:16 p.m., he left the building for an extended period, not returning until much later that evening. When questioned about his activities that Friday, Zocco provided what seemed like a reasonable explanation. He told investigators he had decided to take his summer sports equipment to his mother's house. According to his mother, Joyce Fry, this wasn't unusual behavior. Chris had always been athletic and often stored seasonal equipment at her home. She confirmed that he arrived around 6:30 p.m. with golf clubs and baseball equipment, and nothing about his demeanor struck her as particularly unusual. But investigators were suspicious about the timing. Why would someone choose to move sports equipment on a Friday evening? Particularly when they had plans with their girlfriend, more importantly. They wondered what had happened to that silver travel golf bag that multiple people had seen in his apartment, but which had now mysteriously disappeared the evening of Kelly's disappearance. Zocco was expected at his girlfriend Megan's house for their regular Friday night dinner. However, he didn't arrive until 8:45 p.m., more than an hour later than planned. This left a significant gap of unaccounted time between when he left his mother's house and when he appeared at Megan's apartment. During this missing hour, investigators theorized that Zocco was searching for the perfect location to dispose of Kelly's body. Rural Wisconsin offered countless possibilities, from dense forests to remote farmland. But finding the right spot would take time and careful consideration. The fact that his cell phone was turned off during this period only heightened their suspicions. When Zocco finally arrived at Megan's apartment, she immediately noticed something was wrong. He seemed agitated, nervous, and kept fiddling with his phone, claiming it wasn't working properly. Throughout the evening, his behavior remained erratic. He was restless, unable to settle down, and seemed preoccupied with something she couldn't identify. But it was what happened during the night that Megan found most disturbing. Zocco was sweating profusely, so heavily that she actually had to change the bed sheets in the middle of the night. She had never experienced anything like this with him before, and it left her deeply concerned about his physical and mental state. For investigators, Zocco's excessive sweating made perfect sense within the context of their theory. If Kelly's body was indeed locked inside that golf bag in the trunk of his car, parked just outside Megan's apartment building, the psychological pressure would have been enormous. He couldn't leave the body in his apartment because that would be the first place anyone would look for Kelly. But he also couldn't dispose of it immediately without careful planning. The following morning brought new challenges for Zocco. If investigators' theory was correct, he still had Kelly's body in his car and needed to find a permanent solution. What happened next would provide some of the most puzzling clues in the entire case. Zocco embarked on what appeared to be an unusual shopping trip. He drove over 80 miles from Milwaukee to a small cheese shop called the Mouse House, located near Madison, Wisconsin. For a round trip of 160 miles, he purchased a single half-pound wedge of cheese, claiming it was a gift for his girlfriend's parents. To investigators, this explanation made little sense. Wisconsin was famous for its cheese, with specialty shops throughout the state. Why would someone drive such an enormous distance to purchase such a small amount of cheese from one particular shop? The route to the Mouse House took Zocco through miles of rural farmland, countless remote locations where a body could be disposed of without detection. The timing of this trip was also suspicious. Zocco had left his girlfriend's apartment early Saturday morning, presumably while she was still sleeping. He could have disposed of Kelly's body anywhere along that route and still had the cheese purchase as an alibi for his presence in the area. The receipt from the Mouse House would provide documentation that he had a legitimate reason for being so far from Milwaukee. But Zocco made a critical error on his return journey. Security cameras at a shopping center captured him entering a Sports Authority store, where he used his credit card to purchase a brand new pair of sneakers. For investigators, this purchase raised immediate red flags. Why would someone buy new shoes in the middle of what was supposed to be a simple cheese-buying expedition? Their theory was that Zocco had been forced to replace footwear that might have been contaminated with evidence while disposing of Kelly's body. Perhaps he had stepped in mud, blood, or other material that could link him to the crime. By purchasing new shoes and presumably discarding the old ones, he was attempting to eliminate potential evidence. The credit card receipt for the sneakers provided investigators with a crucial piece of the timeline puzzle. The purchase was made at 12:11 p.m., and they knew from the cheese shop receipt that he had been at the Mouse House at 9:55 a.m. The distance between these two locations was only 54 miles, a drive that should have taken approximately 47 minutes under normal circumstances. Yet there were 90 minutes unaccounted for in Zocco's timeline. 90 minutes was more than enough time to locate a secluded spot off the highway, dispose of a body, and continue on to the shopping center. For investigators, this gap represented the window during which they believed Kelly Dwyer's remains were hidden somewhere in the Wisconsin countryside. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, prosecutors faced a significant challenge. Without Kelly's body, They had no physical proof that a crime had been committed. They had suspicious behavior, lying, missing items, and cadaver dog alerts, but nothing that definitively proved Kelly was dead, let alone that Zocco had killed her. The investigation continued for months, with detectives following up on hundreds of tips and conducting extensive searches of the rural areas along Zocco's suspected route. But the vast expanse of Wisconsin farmland and forest seemed to have swallowed Kelly Dwyer without a trace. Meanwhile, Zocco faced legal consequences for the evidence that had been discovered during the search of his apartment. In November 2014, he went on trial for possession of child pornography found on his electronic devices. Despite his claims that the material had been unknowingly stored on a hard drive from his former workplace in Boston, a jury convicted him on most of the charges. A month later, Zocco pleaded guilty to the drug charges stemming from the cocaine and marijuana found in his apartment. Combined with the child pornography conviction, he was sentenced to 19 years in prison. While this provided some measure of justice, Kelly's family and friends knew that the most serious crime, her suspected murder, remained unprosecuted. The search for Kelly Dwyer seemed hopeless. Months turned into over a year, and despite exhaustive efforts by law enforcement and countless volunteers, there was no trace of the missing woman. The case appeared destined to join the ranks of unsolved disappearances that haunt families forever. But sometimes, when all hope seems lost, fate intervenes in the most unexpected ways. In May 2015, a local man was taking a walk through a wooded area about 45 miles west of Milwaukee. The location was rural and secluded, the kind of place where someone could easily dispose of something without being discovered. As he made his way through the dense undergrowth, something caught his eye. A glint of light was reflecting off something whitish in color among the trees and brush. When he moved closer to investigate, the man made a horrifying discovery. What he had seen was a human skull, partially buried under debris and foliage. He immediately contacted authorities, and within days, dental records confirmed what investigators had suspected for over a year and a half. The remains belonged to Kelly Dwyer. The location where Kelly's body was found was eerily close to the route investigators believed Zocco had taken during his mysterious cheese-buying expedition. The site was just 6 miles from the busy Interstate 94, yet completely hidden from view. It was exactly the type of remote location where someone familiar with the area might choose to dispose of evidence. However, after so much time in the elements, Kelly's skeletal remains could tell investigators very little about how she had died. There were no obvious signs of trauma on the bones, no physical evidence that could definitively establish cause of death. The scene itself yielded no additional clues, no shower curtain fragments, no clothing, no travel golf bag, but there was one detail that investigators found significant. The position of Kelly's skeleton suggested her body had been compressed into a confined space. Her legs were contorted, with one completely twisted, and her left arm was positioned behind her back in an unnatural way. To investigators, this positioning was consistent with someone who had been placed inside a large container, exactly like the missing travel golf bag from Zocco's apartment. With Kelly's body finally recovered, prosecutors felt they had enough evidence to bring charges against Chris Zocco. In 2017, nearly 4 years after Kelly's disappearance, he was indicted for first-degree reckless homicide, hiding a corpse, and strangulation. The state's theory was that Zocco had killed Kelly during a sexual encounter that went tragically wrong. When the case finally went to trial in 2018, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who engaged in increasingly dangerous sexual behavior. They presented evidence of Zocco's pattern of risky conduct with multiple women, behavior that investigators believed had ultimately cost Kelly her life. The defense argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial. They pointed out that there were no eyewitnesses, no DNA evidence, and no definitive proof of how Kelly had died. They suggested that Kelly could have left Zacco's apartment through an exit not covered by security cameras and met her fate elsewhere, possibly at the hands of one of the other men she had been dating through online platforms. But the jury wasn't convinced by the defense arguments. After deliberating for just 3.5 hours, they returned a guilty verdict on all charges. Chris Zacco was sentenced to 31 years in prison, to be served on top of the 19 years he was already serving for the drug and child pornography convictions. The conviction brought some measure of closure to Kelly's family and friends, but it couldn't undo the tragedy of her loss. Kelly Dwyer had been a young woman just beginning to discover herself and her place in the world. She was known for her infectious energy, her caring nature, and her willingness to see the best in people around her. The case serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind seemingly normal relationships. Kelly thought she was involved in a casual dating situation with someone who cared about her. Instead, she had unknowingly become entangled with a man living a double life, someone whose dangerous behaviors would ultimately cost her everything. Today, Chris Zacco remains in prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. Kelly's story has become part of the broader conversation about dating safety, particularly in the age of online platforms where people can easily misrepresent themselves and their intentions. For those who knew and loved Kelly Dwyer, her memory lives on not in the tragic circumstances of her death, but in the vibrant, caring person she was in life. She was someone who brought light into the world, whose loss created a profound void that can never truly be filled. Her story stands as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come from those we trust the most.